Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The air in the cabin hung thick and heavy, like a damp blanket. It wasn't the usual humidity from the rainforest. It felt stale. I'd been coming out to this research outpost in the depths of the Sierra Still Divisor for years. Usually the air was alive with buzzing insects and the fragrant decay of the jungle floor. Now, though, it was just quiet. Too quiet. I checked my watch. 10:17 a.m. The research team was due back last night. Initially, it hadn't been concerning. Weather in the Sierras is unpredictable. Landslides or a washed-out trail could easily delay them. But it was well past sunrise now, and the radio was still silent. I walked to the window, the glass cool against my forehead. The jungle pressed up against the clearing, a wall of emerald and shadow. There should have been movement, a flash of color from a bird, the jerky progress of a monkey. But there was nothing. Just stillness, unnatural, suffocating stillness. A shiver crept down my spine, and I tried to rationalize it away. Just nerves. I poured myself a cup of the remaining lukewarm coffee, its bitter taste doing nothing to settle my unease. The wooden floorboards creaked as I paced, each sound a little too loud in the oppressive silence. I checked the generator. The fuel levels were good, and it was humming along fine, powering the lights and the comms equipment. But there was still nothing. I looked again at the radio, willing it to crackle to life. Nothing. I just tried to concentrate on the task at hand. I spent the next several hours methodically going through the camp, double-checking everything I could think of. Medical supplies. Check. Food stores. Check. Emergency rations. Check. All present. All accounted for. But the silence, it grew. It was a tangible thing, pressing in on me, making the small cabin feel smaller. The air thicker. Around mid-afternoon, the sunlight began to dim, filtering through the leaves in long, golden shafts. The change was gentle at first, then with startling speed. The jungle floor became shrouded in deep shadows, and as the light faded, I had the distinct impression that the forest was advancing, inching closer to the cabin. I could almost feel the countless eyes watching me. It was absurd, of course, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I tried to distract myself. I cleaned my gear, a tedious task I had done for too long. I sharpened some knives and tools, anything to keep my mind occupied. But even the simple act of stropping a blade couldn't completely distract me from the heavy feeling that I was being watched. As twilight deepened, I lit all the lanterns I could find, creating a small island of warm light in the encroaching darkness. I knew the jungle was loud at night. Frogs singing, insects chirping, the occasional rustle of unseen animals. Tonight there was nothing. The silence was like a black hole, sucking in all sound. I wondered if the team felt it too. I decided to try venturing out a bit. I didn't know why. I grabbed my largest hiking bag, filled with essentials, and a powerful flashlight. I stepped onto the porch, and the air outside was colder, even more oppressive than before. Just off the porch, the familiar jungle had transformed. It was different. The vegetation seemed denser, the shadows sharper, and the trees taller. I switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the path in front of me. The plants on either side seemed to writhe and twist in the light, casting grotesque shadows that danced like elongated fingers. I didn't go far. I took a few steps. The ground was soft with leaf litter, and then I turned back. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, followed. I could feel eyes everywhere. An animal, perhaps, I tried to tell myself. Back inside the cabin, I tried to settle in for the night, although sleep seemed impossible. I sat with the lantern and the radio. Hours passed. The only sound, the rhythmic tick of my watch and the dull whir of the generator. Outside, the silence remained absolute. It was more than just quiet. It was a void, a vast nothingness that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin, seeking to seep inside. I wasn't sure what was out there, but at this point, I knew it wasn't normal. This was different. I felt a surge of panic, a cold, clammy feeling that squeezed at my heart. I wanted to run, to just abandon everything, and flee back to the world I knew, but something held me. A morbid curiosity, perhaps. A stubborn refusal to admit that something was terribly wrong. The night wore on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I kept making rounds, checking the generator. The perimeter, the feeling of being watched, grew each time. I started to think that I was going mad. Was it possible, I thought? I had worked in these jungles for years. Never once had I felt this level of irrational fear. Finally, just before dawn, a different kind of silence descended. The oppressive, heavy kind lifted, replaced by something hollow. It was as if the jungle had exhaled all its breath and now waited, empty and still. It was the most terrifying feeling of the day. I felt an urge to just leave. I had to get away from this place. I packed everything and put it outside, ready to go. I waited for the first light, and as the sun began to paint the horizon with streaks of orange and pink, I threw the cabin door open. As I stepped outside, I couldn't see, or hear, or feel anything. It was like I had never been there. It was as if the jungle hadn't existed to start with. I decided to put it behind me, not to look back and leave. I thought as I began to walk that I would never see it ever again. I continued walking through the trees and undergrowth. Then I thought, I've been here many times before, which was true, but it all felt different. The day was hot, not that I could feel it. I walked for a while. Then I realized I couldn't find the path back. I looked around. I couldn't see anything that looked familiar. The trees all looked the same. The light, I noticed, was strangely dim. It was like it was still morning. The sun had barely risen, but it had been hours since that point. And then I noticed for the first time that I felt no wind, and I couldn't hear any life at all. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just the rustling of my own feet. I felt a pang of real fear then. I looked back, but the trees I had just walked through had changed. The jungle had closed in behind me, and I was left with the path ahead, which looked more like a dark tunnel. I was trapped. I knew it. I didn't want to carry on, but it felt like I had no choice. It was like something was tugging me and pushing me forward. I couldn't resist. Not that I wanted to. I just wanted to know where it would take me. As I walked, the light seemed to get worse, and it was hard to see where I was going. I walked slowly, carefully choosing each step. I could hear the leaves crunching under my boots as I moved. I suddenly tripped over something and fell, grabbing at the ground to stop myself. I looked at what I tripped over and saw that it was a tree root, sticking out of the ground as if it was coming out from the ground like a massive finger. It was strange, I thought. I got back up and turned around to carry on, but I saw something this time. I saw what looked like a person standing within the trees in shadows. It was tall and thin, but it seemed to have no face. It just stared at me with what looked like two small holes. I didn't know how long it had been there, but it chilled me to the bone. I blinked my eyes and it was gone. I didn't want to continue anymore, but I couldn't stop the pull I felt. I carried on walking, not sure where I was going. The trees grew dense and seemed to lean into me as I went. The light had almost gone. It was getting dark very quickly. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. I could feel its eyes all over me. I stopped again, but this time I couldn't see anything. I just felt as if I was in it. I felt encased, alone. I started to shake. I wanted out, and I suddenly woke up. I was back in the cabin, and the sun was coming in through the windows. It had all been a dream. I was safe, I thought. I went to the window and looked outside. I saw the trees that were too tall, the shadows that were too sharp. I could feel the eyes watching me, and I knew I hadn't escaped at all. I have no idea what time it is, or what day, and I never will. But yes, story 2. The humidity was a living thing, pressing down on me like a damp shroud. We'd been hiking for days, me and Miguel, deeper into the jungle than I'd ever gone before. Not the tourist-friendly parts either. This was the real deal. A suffocating green world that seemed to hum with a secret, unsettling energy. The sun, a faint disk behind layers of leaves, offered little comfort. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were just going to be scouting a new trail for Miguel's ecotourism company. Something slightly off the beaten path, but nothing too crazy. But then the compass started acting up, just a slight wobble at first. Then the needle began spinning wildly, as if possessed. That's when we realized we were truly lost. Lost among the endless, identical trees. I remember Miguel trying to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a magnetic anomaly in a rock. But the way his eyes flickered around the dense undergrowth told a different story. He wasn't as confident as he sounded. I wasn't either. We continued on, hoping to stumble upon some landmark, any sign that we weren't completely cut off. The light was failing faster. We set up a basic camp in a small clearing. The sounds of the jungle, which had been almost comforting before, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent shivers down my spine. We ate in silence. I lay huddled inside the mosquito net, the sounds of the jungle pressing in on me, but I didn't sleep. The silence between the rustling and croaking of the unseen creatures was more disturbing. It wasn't a natural silence. It felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I found myself staring at the canvas of our tent walls. The thin material, which seemed so solid in the daylight, now felt like nothing at all. It wouldn't have been a barrier to anything. The next day was much the same. Relentless green stretching in every direction, with no sign of a trail, no sign of anything familiar. The compass was still useless. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, a prickling sensation at the base of my neck. It wasn't the kind of watching from an animal, more like something else. We hiked most of the day in silence. We started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Twisted branches arranged as symbols on the ground, like someone had laid them there specifically. A series of perfectly placed rocks in the shape of a crude circle. They seemed too deliberate to be natural, yet completely primitive and untouched by human hands. It was as if someone had been here, but not as we knew them. I found myself starting to question how long we'd been walking. It felt more like a week than 2 days. The days were starting to blur together with the endless trees. I saw that the sun was casting long, distorted shadows. It seemed to linger between the tree trunks. Not a natural light at all, just an unnatural glow. That night, back in the same clearing, I was so on edge I could hardly eat. The night sound seemed louder, sharper, and the silences felt deeper. I peered through the mosquito net. The trees, they weren't just shapes anymore. They had faces. Twisted, gnarly branches formed expressions, mostly of pain. I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Just for a second then, it was gone. My breath hitched in my throat. The next morning, Miguel was gone. His sleeping bag was there, neatly rolled up, as if he'd just gotten up to go to the bathroom. But he wasn't in the trees. No sound of movement. He just vanished. The feeling of being watched intensified. I was completely alone. The jungle didn't feel like a place to be explored. It felt like a hunter's trap. I called out his name, but my voice was swallowed up by the thick foliage. The unnerving silence had returned. I started packing my gear slowly. There was no point in getting worked up. I had to be careful. I wanted to get out of there. I started walking using the sun as a guide. The trees grew denser, the air heavier. I saw more strange patterns, more twisted branches arranged in ways that made no sense. There were small bundles of feathers tied to low-hanging vines. They looked old and worn. The path I was on seemed less like a trail and more like something that was being forced through the jungle. That's when I saw it. A small hut made of mud and leaves, nestled deep within the trees. It wasn't on the map. It was like a place out of time. I moved closer slowly. The air seemed to ripple. I stood still for a moment. I looked through gaps in the walls. Inside, there was nothing. No furniture, no tools, just bare earth. But the air felt heavy in there. Heavy and cold. I felt a pain in my chest, and I knew I had to leave. I started walking fast. I didn't know where I was going. I had just an urge to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. I came to a small stream, and I dropped to my knees. I started washing my face, and I saw something in the water. My own reflection. It was someone else that stared back. Not me, but something else that was looking through. I looked away, blinking to try and clear my vision. I looked back and it was gone. Just my reflection looking back. The last thing I remember is the sound, not the rustling of leaves, not the croaking of frogs, but a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, everything went black. Story 3. The weight of my backpack felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my shoulders. It wasn't just the supplies. There was a coldness about it. A dampness that seemed to seep from the fabric and into my skin. I was hiking the old logging trails near the abandoned town of Silent Hollow, up in the Oregon Cascades. It's a place locals whisper about, claiming the trees themselves hold secrets. Not the good kind. The path was barely there, more a suggestion of a route than a clear trail. Overgrown brush snagged at my boots, and the air, usually crisp and pine-scented, hung thick and still, almost like a held breath. The sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, creating a dim, mottled world of shadows that seemed to shift when I glanced away. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, made me pause, my hand instinctively moving towards the small axe tucked into my belt. It was probably just forest critters, but out here, alone, every little noise carried a different weight. I wasn't searching for anything specific. Not really. Just wanted to see Silent Hollow, a place I'd heard about on old message boards, a place people had vanished from, with no explanation. I'd always been drawn to the unexplained, I suppose. Maybe that was my mistake. The further I walked, the heavier the air felt, the fewer birds I heard. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the forest itself was waiting for something. The trail opened into a clearing, and there it was. Silent Hollow. Not much left, really. The skeletons of wooden buildings, their roofs long collapsed, Their windows hollow sockets staring out into the world. Moss and ferns covered everything in a thick green blanket, as if nature was trying to consume what remained. A rusty swing set stood crookedly in the middle of what I guessed was once a yard. It swayed gently in the breeze, a silent, ghostly reminder of laughter long gone. I walked towards the town, the crunching of leaves underfoot sounding deafening in the unnatural quiet. The skeletal remains of a schoolhouse stood to my left, and I caught the faint scent of damp paper and decay. On my right loomed the frame of what was once the town's grocery store, shelves askew. And now home. I avoided going in. My skin prickled with unease. It felt wrong, like walking in on a private, silent ceremony. I tried to take a picture of the swing, but my phone wouldn't connect. No signal, of course. I knew that logically, but I still felt a tiny prickle of worry. It shouldn't matter. I'd taken a bunch of photos earlier, but I couldn't dismiss this odd feeling. The sky had begun to darken, even though it was still early afternoon. I decided to head back. I didn't like the feeling of being here anymore. The forest felt oppressive now, not just quiet. As I retraced my steps, the trail seemed different, thicker, more winding. I knew I was heading in the right direction, but everything felt just a little bit off. The familiar sounds of the forest I had heard earlier were gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air felt denser, almost like I was walking through water. I started to hear a rhythmic, low, thrumming sound. It wasn't a mechanical noise, more organic, like the pulse of some huge creature deep within the earth. It grew in intensity as I hurried along the trail. The trees seemed to lean in closer to me now, their branches stretching out like accusing fingers. It was getting harder to breathe for some reason. Like the air was somehow missing. Stalling, I picked up my pace, knowing that I needed to get out. I started to see the edge of the forest, the familiar line of my car, now within sight of my eyes. I'm not sure what happened then. I remember seeing my car, just a few meters ahead, and then it was gone. The trees closed around me again. The sound of the low, thrumming noise was now a sickening vibration in my chest. No car, no trail, just more of these trees. Panic set in, a cold terror that gripped me tight. I was lost, not just physically, but in something bigger, something I couldn't comprehend. The trees moved all around me, always in the corner of my eye, a dark mass of green and gray and brown. They seemed to be watching me. I started running, blindly pushing through the undergrowth, not caring where I was going, just that I went. I ran until my lungs burned, and I could feel the blood pumping in my ears so loud that I could barely hear anything else. I stopped. The forest seemed to be the same in all directions. There was no path, no opening, nothing familiar, just these trees, and that thrumming. I sat down at the base of the largest tree I could find, feeling completely empty inside. I watched the dusk come and could feel the trees moving closer to me. I don't know how long I sat there, but a pale light started filtering through the trees. It wasn't sunlight, it was a dull, unnatural glow. The thrumming noise was louder now, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I'm still here. It's been days. I can't get out of the trees. The light never leaves. The thrumming never stops. And I've never been more afraid. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. But I know that I'm probably not going home. Story 4. The sun was a hazy disk, barely piercing the dense canopy of the Paluma rainforest. It was the kind of light that made the shadows deeper and more unsettling, not the sharp, defined shadows of a sunny day, but murky, indistinct shapes that seemed to writhe and shift at the edge of your vision. I wasn't here for fun. I was a researcher, a botanist, tracking a particular species of orchid known to bloom only in the most isolated pockets of this place. I'd been told stories, whispers of this area, things about the lost trails, and people who'd wandered in and never come back. I dismissed them, of course. Local lore, usually nothing to. The jungle had a distinct smell. Not unpleasant, but heavy. Decaying leaves, damp earth, and something else. A cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit, but tinged with something metallic. It clung to the back of my throat, made me slightly nauseous. My boots squelched on the muddy track, the sound swallowed by the sheer volume of life surrounding me. Insects buzzed, their rhythm a constant background hum, occasionally punctuated by the screech of an unseen bird. I pressed on, compass leading me further into the green maze. My GPS signal was patchy at best, the dense foliage interfering with any reliable connection. I checked my map again, feeling a prickle of unease as I realized how far I'd ventured from the marked trails. The orchid hadn't turned up, but I was stubborn. I wanted to see it, record it, understand it. I stopped for a breather near a small, stagnant pool of water. The surface was coated with a slick of algae, reflecting the dim light back at me with an unnatural gleam. As I reached for my water bottle, I noticed something odd at the edge of the pool. A scatter of small white bones. Too small to be human, but too deliberately placed to be accidental. They formed a crude circle, almost like a child's drawing using something much darker. I didn't like it. A shiver ran down my spine despite the muggy heat. I moved on quickly. I continued deeper, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. It wasn't a threatening feeling, not in the way an animal would watch you. It was a cold, detached observation, like I was under a microscope. I checked over my shoulder every few minutes now, my hand instinctively going to the belt pouch where I kept my survival knife. The forest started to change, the trees growing taller and thicker, their branches draped with long hanging vines. It felt ancient, prehistoric. Then I saw it, the sign. A weathered wooden post, almost swallowed by the encroaching roots, with strange symbols carved into it. Not the usual markings of indigenous trails. Something different. Something unsettling. The symbols were simple, yet they resonated with a dark energy, making me feel distinctly unwelcome. The feeling intensified when I noticed a small, woven bundle of what looked like human hair tied to the base of the post. I walked on, now actively trying to resist the urge to turn around and run. The air grew heavy, almost viscous, making it harder to breathe. I noticed the hum of the insects had died down, replaced instead by a disconcerting silence. It wasn't natural silence. It was an expectant hush, like the whole forest was holding its breath. This entire place felt wrong, the air heavy with an unspoken weight. I stumbled into a clearing, a small open space, unlike anywhere else I'd walked today. It wasn't lit by the sun, but by a dim, ethereal glow coming from somewhere beyond the trees. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, covered in what looked like dried blood. The air around it vibrated with a low, almost subsonic hum that I felt more than heard. It was a focal point, an anchor for something I didn't understand. It felt like I'd stumbled into something not meant for my eyes. I didn't stay long. I turned on my heel and walked quickly, then started to jog and run. I didn't care about the orchids, about anything. Just wanted out. I didn't look back, even when I swear I heard something softly call out my name. The forest seemed to fight me every step of the way. Vines snagged at my ankles. The undergrowth seemed to grow denser as I ran. Branches reached out like grasping hands. The light was fading quickly, the shadows growing longer, morphing into shapes in my peripheral vision. There were no longer any sounds of insects, just the sound of my own heavy breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I finally reached the main trail just as it was turning completely dark. I didn't stop running until I got to my vehicle. The feeling of being watched lifted once I'd gone a few miles, and was back on the main highway. I haven't been back, and I've never looked at a map of that region ever since. I'll stick to more well-lit research projects from now on. Story 5. The incessant chirping of unseen insects was my new soundtrack. Not the kind that lulls you to sleep, but the kind that makes you constantly aware that you're not alone. That life of some kind teems all around, just beyond your sight. I arrived at San Cristobal a few days ago, a tiny cluster of stilted houses clinging to the edge of the Amazon. The air here wasn't thick, not like some humid swamp. It was a different kind of heavy, like a damp blanket that pressed against your skin always. I was on a solo research trip documenting the local flora, a botanist with a bad habit of going too far off-grid. The trail I'd chosen wasn't marked on any map I'd found, just a narrow cut through the emerald wall. It began innocently enough, sunlight dappling through the canopy, but soon the trees grew taller, thicker, and the light faded like a dying ember. It wasn't long before a feeling settled over me, an unease that was more than just the usual apprehension of being alone in the wilderness. Everything became shades of green and brown. The sounds morphed from distinct chirps to an almost constant hum, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I kept walking, focusing on the path, or what I thought was the path, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. I remember stopping briefly, taking out my notebook, and realizing my hand was shaking. I wasn't cold, it was something else. I started noticing things, a flash of something white disappearing behind a tree, too quick to be an animal, a faint, almost musical whispering floating on the breeze, a sound that had no source I could discern. Each time this happened, the hairs on the back of my neck would prickle, and I would find my hand gripping the machete a little tighter. I told myself it was just my imagination, the jungle playing tricks. But the feeling deep within my gut said otherwise. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time here was blurred, measured by the shifting light and the slow fade of my energy. I had stopped for a drink from my flask and noticed the water was nearly gone. I realized I hadn't seen a single bird or a mammal for hours. No monkeys, no colorful insects, not even the smallest lizard. The silence was more unnerving than the incessant chirping before, a profound absence of life where life should be overflowing. It felt like something had sucked all the vitality out of the air, like a vacuum cleaner on the energy of the place. The trees grew larger, gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The path, if it had ever been one, was now barely a suggestion. I started to rely more on instinct than any discernible trail. The sun had long since disappeared, the jungle now cloaked in a deep, inky twilight. It was then I saw the structure. It wasn't a house, not exactly. It was an old wooden frame, weathered and warped, almost completely swallowed by the surrounding vegetation. It seemed deliberately hidden, as if someone had constructed it here and then left it to be reclaimed by the forest. There were no walls, just a roof of rotting leaves and vines supported by thick, moss-covered posts. Something about it made me wary, like it was watching me. I circled the structure cautiously, my hand hovering near the machete. There was a small fire pit in the middle, cold and filled with ash. It was strange, a place where someone had clearly spent time, but then seemingly abandoned without a trace. I didn't go inside. I didn't want to. I pressed on. The structure behind me, the dark and unsettling marker on my journey. The feeling of being watched intensified, like invisible eyes boring into my back. The whispers returned, louder now, almost discernible words, but still just out of reach. I couldn't figure out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, full of an ancient sorrow. My body told me to run. And run fast. The jungle seemed to close in then, the trees forming a suffocating wall. The air grew colder, damp. I hurried forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, heart hammering against my ribs. I started to lose the sense of direction, every direction seeming to lead back to where I had been before, and my legs felt heavy like being stuck in mud. The forest seemed to be holding me in a dark embrace. I knew I was lost, proper lost, deep in it. I stopped, leaning against a large tree, desperately trying to gather my wits. I took out my compass. The needle was spinning wildly, useless. The small digital clock on my watch kept blinking. I held my head in my hands, a wave of fear washing over me, a deep primal fear, a fear I had never known. I was completely alone, utterly lost, and something unseen was watching me. The whispering grew louder, less like a whisper now, more like a chorus, a low, mournful chant. It echoed and swirled around me, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed, trapped in this green hell. The place had become a tomb for me. Story 6. The sweat was immediate, even in the shade. Not the slick, uncomfortable kind you get from working, but the clammy, internal kind that tells you your body is already anticipating something. I was just setting up camp, dropping my pack on a patch of what I hoped was dry earth near the edge of the Igbo forest. The air here felt thick, like it was pressing down, and the jungle floor was a tapestry of browns and deep greens, punctuated by the occasional flash of a bright, unnatural fungus. This wasn't some grand expedition or anything, just a solo trip, a way to clear my head, try to find that quiet I never seemed to have back home. I'd been following a hand-drawn map, a really old one, actually given to me by a local guy who'd warned against going too deep. I didn't listen, of course, figuring he was just trying to scare me. The shadows lengthened quickly. I'd barely finished unrolling my sleeping bag when the light began to fade beneath the canopy. It wasn't a gradual shift, but more like a dimmer switch being turned down fast. I packed a headlamp, but I decided to wait a bit, to let my eyes adjust. The silence became a palpable thing. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but something that buzzed in my ears, a low, pervasive hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I could hear the small rustles of life, the skittering sounds of things moving in the undergrowth. But they didn't break the silence. They became part of it, part of that unsettling thrum. I ate a cold meal, a protein bar and some dried mango. A protein bar and some dried mango. The chewing felt too loud. Every snap and crunch amplified in the stillness. After, I decided to explore the area around my camp. Before it got too dark, I stumbled upon a fallen tree, its roots ripped out of the earth like gnarled fingers. The ground there was strangely bare, no undergrowth. The soil packed down like something had been moving there, or something had been pulled away. It didn't sit right with me. It almost felt like a wound in the earth. I didn't linger. Headlamp was next. The beam felt small, a fragile light against the encroaching darkness. The jungle took on a different character. The familiar greens replaced with inky blacks, the trees morphing into strange, threatening shapes. I moved slowly, cautiously, more acutely aware of every sound, every shadow. I started noticing these small, odd things. A rock that looked like it had been intentionally placed, leaning against a tree. A patch of moss growing in a perfect circle. You know, just small things. Things that shouldn't be there. There was this almost deliberate neatness about it that felt unnatural. Back at my camp, I zipped myself into the tent. Feeling the thin nylon separating me from all of it, the silence was heavier now, and the sounds of the jungle seemed sharper, more distinct. I could hear the tiny scratching of some creature on the outer layer of the tent. I tried to rationalize it. Small animals, maybe beetles or a rat. But the scratching was too precise, too intent. It was like something was trying to get in and not making it. Sleep didn't come easily. I found myself waking up every hour or so, heart pounding, listening to the sounds outside. Once I woke up because I'm sure I heard a low, breathy whisper, barely audible, like someone standing outside the tent. But when I tried to listen again, there's nothing. The morning came, a slow gray ascent, the sun barely piercing through the thick canopy. I packed up quickly, trying to ignore the lingering unease that had settled in. The air was cooler, but the unnatural silence still hung heavy. I didn't want anything to do with that camp. I needed to move. I decided to follow a small stream I had spotted the day before. The water was clear but dark, the banks lined with strange luminescent fungi. As I walked, I noticed the trees around the stream were different. They were taller, their bark a pale, almost bone-white color, and they seemed to lean in over the stream, their branches intertwining like bony fingers. It felt like I was walking down an aisle in some forgotten cathedral. I found something else, a small stone structure, partially collapsed, hidden in the undergrowth near the stream bank. It was made of the same pale stone as the trees, and worn smooth with age, which sent a shiver down my spine. It looked like some kind of altar. It felt like this place had been something, once. Now, it just felt wrong. As I moved further down the stream, the humidity had become unreal. My clothes were practically sticking to me, and the silence had taken on a different quality. It had this almost thick, muffled feel to it, like I was underwater. The usual jungle sounds, the insects, the birds, had been replaced with this low, pulsing drone, almost like a heartbeat, in my ears. I had never been so aware of my own breathing. Each inhale and exhale sounded loud, like I was hyperventilating, and I couldn't shake the fact that it seemed to be causing the sound. The drone would pulse when I breathed out, then die when I took a breath in. I tried to hold my breath to prove it, and the pulsing stopped, and I swear the silence almost got louder. It was as if this place only reacted to me. I knew I had to get out. I had to get away. But I could not find the energy to move. I was stuck in place. My body felt like lead. I turned around, ready to face that same path back, but it was gone. I wasn't near the stream anymore. I was completely surrounded by those bone-white trees and the strange fungi, all glowing with an eerie light. The air felt thick and lifeless. No breeze moved through the canopy. It felt like time was slowing down. Every second was an age. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, trying to break through the drone. I started to panic. I had to break out of this, so I tried to run, but my legs felt like I was wading through mud. As I stumbled, I finally realized the drone was coming from the trees. The leaves themselves were making the sound, vibrating so fast it created this constant pulse, and the white bark was not bark at all. It was bone. It was bone. It felt like I was in the heart of some giant beast, and it was sucking the life out of me, slowly. I couldn't run, so I just sat, listening to the pulse of whatever this was, waiting, and hoping I wasn't about to be added to whatever is here with me. Story 7. The sun was a bruised plum hanging low in the sky, and that odd, almost metallic scent of wet earth was thick enough to taste. I'd been trekking the survey markers all day, pushing my way through the tangled undergrowth of the Corcovado National Park. Not my preferred way to spend a Tuesday, I can tell you, but the paycheck was good. And the rainforest, well, it had a strange pull. This particular section of the park was supposed to be relatively untouched, meaning more work, but also, hopefully, more interesting finds. The last marker I needed to locate was supposed to be near the old riverbed, a dry scar of cracked mud and roots that snaked through the dense vegetation. It was getting late, the shadows lengthening, until they felt like solid things pressing in on me from the forest floor. When I finally reached it, the marker was gone. Just a patch of churned up earth, and the unsettling sideways seems to follow something that shouldn't be there. I checked my GPS. It was dead on. The marker should have been there. I circled the area, half-heartedly kicking at the dirt. The birds were quiet now. Not even the screech of a parrot. Just this heavy silence that felt like it was wrapping itself around my throat. A strange sense of unease began to set in. It wasn't a fear exactly, more like a feeling of being watched. I glanced back into the tangle of foliage. Nothing. Just the deep shadows and the faint light filtering weakly through the canopy. I decided to head back to camp. I wasn't about to wander around in the growing darkness searching for some misplaced metal stake. But the path I'd taken in wasn't there. It was like the trees had shifted, rearranged themselves in the short time I'd been looking for the marker. A prickle of something colder than unease ran up my spine. I knew this area. I'd mapped it myself, and now it was different. I tried another direction, moving slowly, my hand on the machete at my hip. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the air, somehow, felt heavier, almost like walking through treacle. I kept telling myself it was just the fatigue, the long day, yet the persistent feeling of being observed, of something else being in the jungle with me, was getting stronger. I could almost feel its presence. Like a weight in the air, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the jungle transitioned into that strange twilight hour, when shapes become indistinct and shadows stretch into grotesque parodies of familiar forms. I pulled out my headlamp and switched it on. The beam of light stabbed through the darkness, revealing the dense underbrush and the dark, gnarled trunks of trees that seemed to watch me with an ancient knowing. I pushed forward, focusing on the ground ahead. I needed to just keep moving, keep walking. Then, the sound started. It was a low, guttural humming, almost like a vibration that you felt in your chest more than heard in your ears. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The humming grew in intensity, a deep resonant sound that made my teeth ache. I stopped, my breath snagging in my throat. The forest felt like it was holding its breath with me. I scanned the beam of my headlamp, my heart hammering against my ribs. My light caught something in the distance, something just beyond the reach of my illumination. A pale white shape, moving slowly, almost drifting amongst the trees. It was too far to make out clearly. The way it moved, that slow, deliberate float, sent a shockwave of ice-cold fear through me. I slowly switched my lamp on and off a couple of times. No response. The form remained still, but I could tell it was still there, watching me. I didn't need any more incentive to turn and run. I crashed through the undergrowth, the humming following me, growing in intensity, seeming to get closer. Branches tore at my clothes, scratched at my face, but I kept going, driven by a primal terror. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I finally burst out of the tree line, stumbling onto the small dirt track leading toward the camp. I could see the faint glow of the lanterns from the tents, and the relief that washed over me was powerful. But even as I stumbled towards safety, I could still feel it. The presence in the trees, the low guttural hum that still resonated in my bones. A chilling reminder that I had been seen and observed. And now they knew where my camp was, too. Story 8. The sun was already a hazy memory behind the thick canopy when I first noticed it. Not the sound, not initially. It was a subtle shift in the light filtering through the leaves, a peculiar dimming that made the ferns appear almost gray. I adjusted the strap of my pack, the weight of my research gear feeling heavier than it should, the sweat prickling between my shoulder blades. I was deep into the rainforest, near the foothills of the Cardamom Mountains in Cambodia, months into my solo study on the local flora. It was supposed to be a routine survey trip, mapping a new section where I'd spotted some promising samples on satellite images, a place the locals called the Whispering Glade, or or something close to it. I hadn't taken the name seriously. The air felt heavy, not just with humidity, but with something else, something thick and still. It pressed in, making it hard to breathe. It was like the jungle itself was holding its breath. I chalked it up to the coming dusk, the usual shift in atmospheric pressure, and kept pushing through the undergrowth. Then I heard it. A low, drawn-out sigh, almost like the wind caught in a tunnel. But the air was still, completely still. No wind in the leaves, no rustling. Just that unnerving sound coming seemingly from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stopped, my hand instinctively going to the machete at my hip. I'm not normally one to scare easily, but something about that sound did not sit right. I scanned my surroundings, the light fading more rapidly now, making the dense vegetation look like monstrous shadows. Towering trees loomed overhead, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal claws. I tried to pinpoint the origin of the sound, turning my head this way and that. Nothing. Yet the sigh lingered, a phantom echo in the air, barely there but impossible to ignore. I told myself it was my imagination, some trick of the jungle. We have all been out in the middle of nowhere, hearing noises, tricking ourselves into seeing things. It was that same feeling. I tried to regain my focus. I pulled out my notebook and forced myself to record some of my findings, noting the unique structure of a particular orchid nearby, trying to re-establish a sense of normalcy. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound now. This eye had gone, but it returned later, when I had pitched my small tent and was eating a cold meal. The new sound was a low rhythmic thrumming, like a heartbeat deep underground. I put my cup down, listening intently. It was vibrating the ground beneath me ever so slightly. I could feel a slight tingle on the soles of my feet. This place isn't right, I thought. This is just not right. I had set up my camp, as I always did, along a slightly less dense patch of undergrowth, far enough away from the main jungle where the thickest foliage resided. It was as if the jungle was trying to send me a message, telling me to leave. I finished my meal quickly and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut. The thrumming continued, seemingly growing louder. It felt like the jungle was alive, breathing, a massive entity with its own internal rhythms, which I had started to feel. I lay on my camping mat, staring at the thin nylon of the tent, the light of my head torch creating eerie shadows. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it seemed to vibrate within me. A relentless reminder that I wasn't alone here. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, feeling like I was being watched. The next morning I broke camp quickly, not really caring for my routine. I didn't even take a sample of the orchid I had previously admired. The jungle felt different. The trees were taller, their branches darker and more twisted. The undergrowth was denser, seemingly pressing in on the narrow path I was trying to take. I felt an overwhelming urge to break into a run, to get away from this place, but I forced myself to walk, making my way through the jungle as fast as possible. It wasn't the humidity that made my clothes stick to my body. It was a cold sweat, a cold fear. I kept my head down, only looking where I was stepping. I was scared to look up, scared of what I may see. The thrumming had stopped, replaced with an unsettling silence. A silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the air itself was pressing against my eardrums. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of eyes, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I felt like something was slowly closing in around me. I decided to cut my trip short, heading out the way I had came in, back into the main path. I knew the trail that connected to the small village a few hours' walk away, but something was off. The path, usually clear, seemed to have been overgrown overnight. It was like I had to fight my way through the foliage. My pace quickened, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the trail. It was there. As I tried to regain my bearings, I noticed a familiar object just off in the jungle, a marker I had put up months earlier. That marker should have marked the start of the Whispering Glade. It wasn't. It was just as I was trying to navigate that I felt a sharp pain in my head, and my vision began to blur. I knew I was in trouble. I sat down on the trail and slowly drifted away. When I came back to, I had no idea how long I had been out for, but the sun hadn't moved much, indicating it couldn't have been too long. I felt weak. I knew I had to get out of there and back to the village. So I stood up and began to hobble towards the village. I came across a familiar landmark, one I had visited many times before, a giant rock shaped like a turtle. That was another marker I'd put down during my first expedition. I stopped. I didn't expect to find it here. I only remembered putting it about 15 minutes from my camp. This rock was at least an hour from where I set up. The trail was different. This was not the direction to the village. A wave of panic washed over me. I started to think of all the stories the locals told me. The old tales of people getting lost in the woods, never to be seen again. These stories I chalked up to superstition, but now they felt very real. I started to run, not caring for the foliage, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and branches. My legs were burning. My breath came in short gasps. I stopped. I looked around. I was still in the jungle, with no sense of direction. It didn't matter which direction I ran. I was still trapped deep in the wilderness. Suddenly I had flashbacks to the place they called the Whispering Glade. It was like my mind was trying to give me the answers. The ferns, the strange light, the sounds, the feeling. I felt a lump forming in my throat and a wave of sickness rushed over me. I turned around to the direction I had been running and slowly made my way back. I had to face it. I had to face whatever was in the jungle and try and figure out what was going on. The last rays of daylight were fading as I found my way back to the spot where I thought I'd camped. I knew something was wrong when it was still daylight, although it felt like dawn. Everything was different. My camp had been cleared away, like nothing had ever been there. All that was left was the patch of flattened out foliage. I could feel the cold sweat come back again. I was about to be sick. Something in the corner of my eye made me jump. In the distance, under the canopy, I could see an odd movement, like a shadow flickering back and forth. I knew I had to face the darkness. I had to find out what it was. I took a deep breath, pulled my machete from my hip, and started to make my way towards that shadow. Story 9. The old map was brittle, the paper almost translucent in the dim light of my tent. I unfolded it on my sleeping bag, the faint scent of mildew and ancient ink filling the small space. This wasn't some tourist map. It was a hand-drawn thing, probably a century old, detailing the trails and forgotten settlements of the Amazon, specifically a region a bit west of Manaus. I found it tucked inside a dusty box at a collector's shop back in the States, alongside a diary filled with cryptic entries about whispers in the jungle. The diary mentioned Cascavel Ridge and a place called the Hollow Tree of Shadows, both marked on the map in faded red ink. I wasn't looking for ghosts, not exactly. My PhD was in anthropology, focusing on isolated communities. And this region, according to the little research I could find, was once home to a group that seemed to just vanish. No trace in any historical record, no ruins report, just whispers and this map. I was looking for understanding, sure, but maybe a little bit of something more too. The day's trek had been long, the humidity a thick blanket clinging to my skin. The air hadn't moved all day. The forest floor was a tangled mess of roots and decaying foliage, each step a careful negotiation with the terrain. I'd pushed myself hard, following the thin, almost invisible trail the map indicated. Now, as the light faded, I was close to where the map denoted Cascabel Ridge. The sounds of the jungle at dusk began to intensify. The cicadas whirred a constant high-pitched song, and the deep croaks of unseen frogs mixed with the rustling of leaves. However, there was something different, something just below the surface. A low, almost vibration that I couldn't quite place. Not an animal, not the wind, but I could feel it in my chest. A low hum, a faint unease that settled over me. I figured it was just the isolation, the exhaustion. I ate dinner in silence, the canned beans cold and metallic in my mouth. Flashlight created a claustrophobic circle of light around me, the shadows beyond dancing like dark figures. I made sure my machete was within reach and tried to occupy myself by looking at the map, tracing the faded lines with my finger. The ridge was just ahead, marked by a series of small, almost comical-looking drawings of snakes. I knew logically that I was just tired and my imagination was running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally drifted off to sleep, but not deeply. I kept waking up, disoriented, my heart thumping in my chest. I hear the constant hum that I'd been hearing before. I saw shadows flicker at the edge of the light, shapes that I couldn't quite make out. Each time, nothing was there. Each time I checked every inch of my surroundings. But it was just the jungle, and the hum, just like before. The next morning, the jungle looked different, almost muted. The usual cacophony of birds was strangely absent. There was a stillness to the air that was unnerving, heavier than even the humidity. I packed, feeling a new urgency to push on. Cascabel Ridge was close. I could feel it. The path grew steeper, the trees gradually giving way to rocky outcrops. When I finally reached the crest of the ridge, I paused. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Below me stretched a valley, almost hidden, cloaked in an unusual mist that was thicker than the early morning fog. It clung to the trees like a shroud, muting all the colors and sounds. It gave everything an eerie, almost unnatural glow. It was also completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dense, still silence. The map indicated that the hollow tree of shadows was there, somewhere. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The air felt cold here, despite the general mugginess of the jungle. As I descended into the valley, the mist seemed to swirl around me, the silence growing louder with each step. The trees here were ancient, gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air was heavy, oppressive. It felt like I was wading through mud. I felt my heart begin to race as I realized I couldn't hear even my own footsteps. I moved slowly, scanning the area. The map held tight in my hand. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and rotting branches. I started to feel a heavy pressure in my head. Not a headache exactly, more a dull ache behind my eyes. I also started to feel disoriented. I kept looking at my map, making sure that I was going in the right direction. But it was as if it was changing. I felt like everything around me was shifting, like the trees were moving, the ground was tilting, and I saw it. In the center of the valley, a massive tree stood alone, its trunk so wide it seemed impossible, like a petrified giant. Its bark was black, almost glistening, and a large, gaping hole marred its base, a dark mouth leading into shadows I couldn't penetrate. This was it. Hollow tree of shadows. I walked slowly towards it. The silence becoming suffocating. I was losing my sense of direction. The valley seemed to be closing in on me. Just past the tree, I noticed something on the ground, almost buried in the leaves. I moved closer. It was a bone, then another, then several. Scraps of clothing torn, rotted. I picked up a piece of cloth. The pattern faded, but it felt disturbingly familiar. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't a human gaze, not an animal one either. It was something ancient, something cold, and something hungry. The low hum, the vibration I'd been hearing so faintly, was now a powerful thrum, resonating around and in my body. I felt a deep, instinctual fear, a primal urge to flee. I stood up, my body trembling. I looked at the opening of the old tree. It felt like it was beckoning me. The darkness inside seemed to be moving, swirling. I felt nauseous, my head pounded. I took a step back, then another. I didn't want to look at the tree, but I couldn't look away. It was like a magnet. I began to run. I don't know how long I ran for. I didn't look back at the tree. I just ran. The mist swirled around me. The trees seemed to close in on me. The trees seemed to close in on me. I could feel the thing, whatever it was, still watching me, still following me. I don't know if I'll ever escape it. I don't know if I want to. I'm back in my tent now. It's night. The jungle is loud again, but still feels different. I'm shaking. I can't stop shaking. The sounds are all wrong. I know that the tree is still there. I know that whatever is in there is waiting. I can feel it listening, feel it watching, just waiting for me to fall asleep. Or maybe I'm already asleep. Maybe this is all just a nightmare. But if it is, I don't think I'll ever wake up. Story 10. The late afternoon sun, already beginning its descent, cast long, distorted shadows across the muddy track. I was in the thick of it. The Bornean rainforest this time. A place that felt both ancient and intensely alive. A living, breathing thing that seemed to watch me from behind a curtain of emerald leaves. The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. It wasn't oppressive, not in the way the humidity sometimes could be, but it was expectant, like the jungle was waiting for something to happen. I was alone, as always, on a research trip for my PhD. I'm studying the behavioral patterns of a specific species of monkey, one that prefers the deeper parts of the forest. I had ventured further than usual, drawn by a series of unusual calls I'd been tracking for the last few days. The feeling of isolation wasn't new. I'd grown used to it, but today, it was laced with an edge of disquiet. I reached a small clearing. The trees opened up, revealing a patch of ground covered with tangled roots and fallen branches. A creek, barely more than a trickle, gurgled quietly nearby. It was here I found the first anomaly. A scattering of small, roughly carved wooden dolls lay half buried in the mud. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, crude and unsettling, with oversized heads and blank, staring eyes. They weren't toys. Certainly not the kind a child would have made. They felt ritualistic. I didn't touch them. I took a few pictures, my hands feeling strangely cold despite the warmth of the air, then moved on, trying to shake off the growing unease. I continued along the creek's edge. As I went deeper into the forest, the lights started to fade. The sounds of the jungle shifted, the familiar chirps and whistles replaced by a rustling, almost like whispering. I kept moving. Soon, the trees seemed to close in around me, their massive trunks like sentinels guarding a hidden realm. I had the odd sensation that there was someone just out of sight, moving in parallel to me. I stumbled off the path into a small grotto. The air was noticeably colder, and the smell intensified. It was a mix of dampness and something else, something metallic. I saw it then. A small, deep pool of water, black as ink, and floating in the middle, a single white flower, stark against the darkness. It was out of place, unnatural, and the feeling of being watched was close now. I moved back to the path, deciding to turn back. The forest had been beautiful, but now it was foreboding. I was on my way back, retracing my steps, but the path looked different now. The markings I'd made on the trees harder to find. The light was almost completely gone, and the rustling was constant now, surrounding me from all sides. I tried to stay calm, to focus on each step, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the very air thick with its disapproval. I walked faster now. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I could hear my own footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. There was no more bird song, no more monkey chatter, only the constant, unnerving rustling and a distant drip of water. I found myself running now, pushing through the undergrowth, my fear propelling me forward. The trees all looked the same. The path had disappeared, lost to the darkness in my own panic. I stopped running, trying to get my bearings, but I was turned around. The darkness was overwhelming now, and the rustling had become a steady whisper, a low, sibilant sound that seemed to surround me. I could see nothing, but I could feel them now. Something moving through the trees, closing the distance. It wasn't an animal. I knew that instinctively. I kept going, my hand reaching out to touch the cold bark of a tree, feeling the moss, seeking an anchor in this awful night. The forest was no longer just a place. It was an entity, and it was hunting me. I remember thinking, I shouldn't have gone so far. I was never able to get out, and the forest keeps me. Story 11. The drone of the cicadas was almost a physical thing, like a low thrumming that vibrated in my bones. It was late afternoon in the foothills of the Annamite Range, the sun already dipping behind the dense canopy, painting the jungle in shades of bruised purple and deep emerald. I wasn't supposed to be this far off the trail. My map, a crumpled thing I'd printed off some dodgy website, had promised a faint path heading deeper into the woods, towards what it called the Whispering Caves. I was here for the photos mostly, but also a bit of a personal challenge. A local guy at the small village had warned me against it. He'd spoken with a low voice about spirits guarding places best left alone, but I'd dismissed it as local folklore. The terrain was getting tougher. The ground was a tangled mess of exposed roots and slick leaves, each step needing deliberate thought. I kept the camera slung around my neck, its weight a constant reminder of my purpose here. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the earthy smell of decaying vegetation. It wasn't just the heat and humidity that made me feel like I was wading through something tangible. There was a heaviness, a sense of being watched that prickled at the edge of my awareness. I eventually found what looked like a faint deer trail breaking off from the main path and followed it. It narrowed quickly, disappearing under hanging vines. I pushed my way through, the leaves brushing cold against my skin, despite the heat. It was getting darker now, the light filtering through the leaves in fractured bands. I was definitely off the map now, relying on what little I could see to guide me. The sounds of the jungle seemed to shift, morphing into something less natural. The constant hum of insects faded, replaced by a low, almost inaudible whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the leaves, but there was a pattern to it, a kind of rhythmic murmur. I stopped, listening intently. It felt like the jungle itself was speaking, a chorus of hushed voices just beyond my reach. I decided to keep moving. A short trek led to some kind of clearing, if it could be called that. It was a small space, hemmed in by thick stands of bamboo, and in the middle loomed the dark, gaping maw of a cave entrance. The opening looked unnatural, a black void against the deep greens. The whispering seemed to be stronger here, swirling around me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I took out my camera and snapped a couple of pictures even while feeling the urge to turn and leave. The moment I took the lens cap off, something changed. The air grew colder, almost oppressive. The whispering intensified, feeling less like distant voices and more like they were right beside me. It became less of a background noise, more like a chant, a repetitive low-toned drone. I peered into the camera viewer, trying to get a better focus on the cave opening, but the screen was filled with static. I adjusted settings, but it was still the same. I lowered the camera and just looked with my eyes. The opening of the cave. It was still there, but now it seemed to move, shifting slightly. Not the physical rock, but the darkness inside it seemed to writhe. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I turned away, intending to leave. My heart pounded in my ears, matched by a frantic, rising urge to get away, to break into a run and not look back. And something caught my eye. To the side of the caves, I saw a small pile of things. On closer look, they seemed like tattered scraps of fabric, maybe some sort of clothing, all faded and covered in moss, and what looked like old bones scattered amongst them. They seemed like human bones. I looked around again, trying very hard not to look into that black void of the cave. The whispering was now much louder, almost deafening, and it felt like it was pulling me in. I was being drawn toward the cave entrance. My legs felt heavy. I tried to move away, but my feet were slow, like they were wading through treacle. I fumbled with my camera again, trying to capture the pile of scraps. The static was still there. I couldn't even get a picture of it. I took a picture of the leaves in front of me, trying to see if it would work, and it did. What happened to my camera? I took a step backwards, and a twig snapped under my foot. The sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Immediately the whispering surged. The ground seemed to rumble slightly. I turned my back to the dark entrance and ran. I didn't need to know what was in there. I ran and ran, without looking back. I didn't stop running till I broke through the foliage and looked into the trail. I didn't slow down. I kept going, not really thinking. I was going to make it. I knew it. I'm sitting at the base of a large tree, in the middle of the path I was supposed to be on, and I'm trying to bring myself back to the present again. My hands are shaking, my clothes sticking to my skin. The sun is almost gone, and the jungle is a symphony of night sounds. The whispering is fainter here, the background hum, but I can still hear it. I can still feel it. I knew that the path was going to be hard, and I knew I wanted adventure, but I feel like I went too deep. I need to get back. I need to get out of here. I stood up, looked down at my legs, and started walking. Story 11. The drone of the cicadas was almost a physical thing, like a low thrumming that vibrated in my bones. It was late afternoon in the foothills of the Annamite Range, the sun already dipping behind the dense canopy, painting the jungle in shades of bruised purple and deep emerald. I wasn't supposed to be this far off the trail. My map, a crumpled thing I'd printed off some dodgy website, had promised a faint path heading deeper into the woods, towards what it called the Whispering Caves. I was here for the photos mostly, but also a bit of a personal challenge. The local guy at the small village had warned me against it. He'd spoken with a low voice about spirits guarding places best left alone, but I'd dismissed it as local folklore. The terrain was getting tougher. The ground was a tangled mess of exposed roots and slick leaves, each step needing deliberate thought. I kept the camera slung around my neck, its weight a constant reminder of my purpose here. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the earthy smell of decaying vegetation. It wasn't just the heat and humidity that made me feel like I was wading through something tangible. There was a heaviness, a sense of being watched that prickled at the edge of my awareness. I eventually found what looked like a faint deer trail breaking off from the main path and followed it. It narrowed quickly, disappearing under hanging vines. I pushed my way through, the leaves brushing cold against my skin, despite the heat. It was getting darker now, the light filtering through the leaves in fractured bands. I was definitely off the map now, relying on what little I could see to guide me. The sounds of the jungle seemed to shift, morphing into something less natural. The constant hum of insects faded, replaced by a low, almost inaudible whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the leaves, but there was a pattern to it, a kind of rhythmic murmur. I stopped, listening intently. It felt like the jungle itself was speaking, a chorus of hushed voices just beyond my reach. I decided to keep moving. A short trek led to some kind of clearing, if it could be called that. It was a small space, hemmed in by thick stands of bamboo, and in the middle loomed a dark, gaping maw of a cave entrance. The opening looked unnatural, a black void against the deep greens. The whispering seemed to be stronger here, swirling around me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I took out my camera and snapped a couple of pictures even while feeling the urge to turn and leave. The moment I took the lens cap off, something changed. The air grew colder, almost oppressive. The whispering intensified, feeling less like distant voices and more like they were right beside me. It became less of a background noise, more like a chant, a repetitive low-toned drone. I peered into the camera viewer, trying to get a better focus on the cave opening. But the screen was filled with static. I adjusted settings, but it was still the same. I lowered the camera and just looked with my eyes. The opening of the cave. It was still there, but now it seemed to move, shifting slightly. Not the physical rock, but the darkness inside it seemed to writhe. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I turned away, intending to leave. My heart pounded in my ears, matched by a frantic, rising urge to get away, to break into a run and not look back. And something caught my eye. To the side of the caves, I saw a small pile of things. On closer look, they seemed like tattered scraps of fabric, maybe some sort of clothing, all faded and covered in moss, and what looked like old bones scattered amongst them. They seemed like human bones. I looked around again, trying very hard not to look into that black void of the cave. The whispering was now much louder, almost deafening, and it felt like it was pulling me in. I was being drawn toward the cave entrance. My legs felt heavy. I tried to move away, but my feet were slow, like they were wading through treacle. I fumbled with my camera again, trying to capture the pile of scraps. The static was still there. I couldn't even get a picture of it. I took a picture of the leaves in front of me, trying to see if it would work, and it did. What happened to my camera? I took a step backwards, and a twig snapped under my foot, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Immediately the whispering surged. The ground seemed to rumble slightly. I turned my back to the dark entrance and ran. I didn't need to know what was in there. I ran and ran, without looking back. I didn't stop running till I broke through the foliage and looked into the trail. I didn't slow down. I kept going, not really thinking. I was going to make it. I knew it. I'm sitting at the base of a large tree, in the middle of the path I was supposed to be on. And I'm trying to bring myself back to the present again. My hands are shaking, my clothes sticking to my skin. The sun is almost gone, and the jungle is a symphony of night sounds. The whispering is fainter here, the background hum, but I can still hear it. I can still feel it. I knew that the path was going to be hard, and I knew I wanted adventure, but I feel like I went too deep. I need to get back. I need to get out of here. I stood up, looked down at my legs, and started walking. Story 12. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves was thick, almost suffocating. Not the usual earthy smell you get after a rain. This was something else, a heavy, cloying sweetness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I'd been tracking the small game trail for maybe an hour, deeper into this section of the Mato Grosso than I usually went. The sun, already high, barely pierced the canopy, casting the place in a perpetual twilight that played tricks on my eyes. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Maybe a photograph for the nature magazine I sometimes contributed to, or a new bird call to record, really. I just needed a break from the stifling village, with its constant chatter and the ever-present hum of the generator. The quiet of the jungle was usually my medicine, but this quiet felt different. It was a silence that pressed in, a heavy blanket that muffled even the usual rustling of leaves. There were no bird songs, no monkey calls, not even the faint chirping of insects, just an unnerving void of sound. I paused, letting my senses become my guide, not my logic. Something felt off. I continued moving, though now with a slower, more deliberate pace. The path became less defined, winding through thickets of dense vegetation. Twisted vines hung like grotesque works of art, their shapes shifting and changing in the dim light. The shadows danced in my peripheral vision, teasing me with fleeting, indistinct forms. I came across a small clearing. A dilapidated wooden structure stood in the center, almost swallowed by the encroaching jungle. It was a simple shack, built from rough-hewn planks and covered in vines. It looked ancient, abandoned decades ago perhaps. A small, crude doorway sagged open, like a dark, gaping mouth. I told myself, it was probably just an old field research station. Curiosity, a nagging sense of the unknown, dragged me towards it. I didn't go inside immediately. I walked the perimeter, feeling the rough bark of the trees near the shack, noticing this strange, almost unnatural growth of moss and fungus. This wasn't the normal, vibrant greenery of the jungle. It was pallid, almost sickly. The air here was colder, a noticeable drop that sent a shiver down my spine, despite the humidity. There was an unnatural stillness around the place that was more unnerving than anything I'd encountered before. Finally, I stepped inside. The air inside was heavy and stale, like something had been trapped there for a long, long time. The room was small and bare, with a single rusted metal cot in the corner. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust and scattered fragments of what looked like paper. I noticed a strange symbol faintly scratched into the wall, an intricate pattern of interconnected circles and lines. I had never seen anything like it, not in any of the local indigenous art I knew. It felt ancient, even older than the shack itself. I lingered for a moment more. Something about the place was unsettling me deep down. Quiet wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. I decided to leave. I took a different path out of the clearing, not wanting to retrace my steps. This new path was even more overgrown, and the dim light was even more oppressive. I started walking faster, the unease growing. It wasn't just the darkness or the quiet anymore. There was a feeling, a sense of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The path led me to a small stream, barely a trickle. The water was murky and dark, reflecting the dim light in a disturbing way. I knelt down to drink, but something in the water's surface caught my eye, a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision. I stared, trying to see what it was. But it was gone, swallowed by the dark water. I straightened up quickly. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I started to run. Not fast, but a hurried, desperate pace. I didn't care about disturbing the animals. I just needed to get back to familiar ground, back to the village. As I ran, the trees seemed to close in. The path became a tunnel of shadows, the ground uneven and treacherous. The air felt thick as lead, making it hard to breathe. I could hear the heavy thumping of my own heart against my ribs and the desperate gasping of my breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was moving just out of the corner of my vision. I finally broke through the dense undergrowth and into a relatively open woodland area. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against the thick tree trunk. The light here was a bit better. I could see the clear daylight streaming in from a small gap in the foliage above. I was starting to think maybe it was just in my head. Maybe I'd just gotten spooked. Then I saw it, the flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye again, near the stream I just left. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint it, but it moved again quickly further into the clearing. A glimpse of something dark and indistinct. Gone before I could focus, I started walking again, pushing forward, but fear had taken hold. I didn't dare to look back, didn't dare to stop. I kept going, my legs aching, my lungs burning, but I couldn't stop. I finally emerged from the tree line into a familiar area close to the village. I could hear the sounds of life, the distant chatter of people, the barking of dogs. It flooded the quiet of my mind that had been dominated by the quiet of the jungle. I kept walking, eyes wide, until I reached the first few houses, finally allowing myself to let go of the horrible dread it had created in me. I made it home. I haven't gone back to that part of the jungle since. Maybe it was just the heat, my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of dread, the heavy sense of being watched, that lingering sense of something else being near, it was real. And I know, deep down, that some things are best left undisturbed. Some silence is better left unbroken. The jungle keeps its secrets and holds on to them tight. And I am no longer willing to find out what. Story 13. The sun was a pale disk behind the thick canopy, barely managing to filter through the dense leaves of the Sirpe jungle. Not the usual suffocating humidity. Instead, the air hung heavy and still, like a damp cloth. I was tracking a peccary, a small wild pig, and the trail had led me deeper than I intended. I've been doing this for years, guiding small groups on wildlife photography expeditions. So I know this jungle. Or, I thought I did. The usual symphony of the forest, the buzz of insects, the chattering monkeys, seemed muffled here, replaced by a quietness that felt intentional. Almost like the jungle itself was holding its breath. I'd started this track about 2 hours ago, and the light was already beginning to fade quicker than I'd anticipated. I'm usually a good judge of time, but today was different. The peccary's trail wound around a massive ceiba tree, its roots like colossal, tangled serpents emerging from the earth. I followed it with my boots crunching through the fallen leaves, and I noticed a small, abandoned structure nestled amongst the trees. It looked old, maybe a forgotten hunting blind, but constructed from rough-hewn logs and overgrown with vines. I paused, a prickle of unease scratching at the back of my neck. It wasn't the type of structure locals would abandon. I pushed the vines aside, peering inside. The air within was unexpectedly cold, despite the warm day outside. The floor was damp earth, and in the center there was a simple fire pit, the ashes still a charcoal gray, like they'd been extinguished recently. I couldn't shake the image of a campfire, flickering in this dark space, and for a moment, the temperature seemed to drop again around me. My breath puffed out, visible against the gloom. I'd never experienced that level of chill out here before. I backed away, feeling silly. It was just an old shelter. I told myself that. But the feeling lingered, a cold knot in my gut. So I resumed following the peccary trail, which oddly enough seemed to lead away from the familiar areas. It was becoming more and more overgrown. The plants a dense, almost impenetrable wall on either side. The light continued to thin, and the shadows grew long and distorted, playing tricks on my eyes. Everything looked different now, more menacing. What had been a clear trail just minutes ago was turning into a maze of tangled vines and fallen trees. I checked my compass, just to reassure myself. It pointed north, as expected, but my sense of direction felt strangely off. Skewed, I started to hear sounds. Not the usual jungle sounds. These were subtle, a rustling in the undergrowth, a soft thud, like something heavy landing on the forest floor. They were always just outside my field of vision, always a step behind. I quickened my pace, trying to reach a clear area, anywhere that wasn't so claustrophobic and thick. I found a small creek, the water black as ink in the twilight. There are normally fish in these, and it was strange that the area was silent. No splashes, no buzz of insects. I had to cross it, but for a second I hesitated. The reflection in the water wavered, and for a split second I wasn't sure if I saw my own face staring back. The water was perfectly still, except for the disturbing ripple that ran across it as I stepped in, causing a shiver to run down my spine. On the other side, the trees grew even closer, the canopy overhead sealing out the last vestiges of daylight. It was getting increasingly difficult to see, and I was relying more on my sense of touch. I pulled out my headlamp, switching it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, but seemed unnervingly weak. The circle of light felt small and insignificant against the inky blackness. I continued walking, trying to put some distance between myself and the creek, and the eerie feeling I had there. But the sounds were still there, just behind me. The rustling, the thudding, it was all around me now, and I could sense something. No, someone was watching. I kept turning around, but seeing nothing. I stumbled upon another structure, this one much larger than the last. It was what appeared to be an old research camp, a relic of some abandoned project. The buildings were dilapidated, and the windows were dark eye sockets, staring out, and it felt like they were staring at me. A rusted fence surrounded the perimeter, creating a sense of enclosure. A chill ran through me, despite the humidity, which seemed to have returned with full force. Perhaps I was more tired than I thought. I pushed the gate open, the metal screaming in protest as it scraped against the rusted hinges. I walked into the compound. I could make out a main building with a veranda, and maybe what looked like a storage shed, a bathroom and a kitchen. It was all ramshackle, covered in vines and moss. The air was heavy with dampness and decay, and felt almost thick, suffocating. I wanted to find an open space, something familiar, or even just a clearing. I kept moving through the compound, looking for a way out. I went into the main building, the floorboards groaning loudly as I walked. My breathing became heavy, and I was becoming more and more unnerved. It was dark inside, and the beam of light from my headlamp was still weak. I could make out tables overturned, broken cabinets, and scattered papers. It looked like someone had been here recently and left in a hurry. I was starting to feel a sense of panic rising. I had never felt more lost. I turned around. The light caught what looked like a photograph lying on the floor. This isn't right, I thought. Why would a photo be on the floor? I picked it up. It was a group photo of what looked like researchers from years ago. It was faded, but I could make out their faces. I felt compelled to look at each person, one by one. As I looked at each face, my stomach turned. My hand went cold, and the photo fell from my hand to the floor. The faces on the photo, they looked just like the faces I saw in the water reflection. I knew I had to get out of here as quickly as possible. I turned around and ran out of the building, not sure where I was going, or if I could trust what I was seeing. The air felt colder. The sounds grew more insistent. The soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. I began to run, pushing through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't know where I was running, just away from the camp, away from the sounds, away from whatever was watching me. I didn't stop running until my legs burned and my lungs ached. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, my heart pounding in my chest. The jungle seemed to close in on me, the trees contorting into menacing shapes. I could hear my labored breathing echo in the stillness. I kept going, running blindly through the darkness. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. The tapping continued, always close, never quite catching up. It was like the jungle itself was chasing me. The feeling of being watched was relentless, and I could no longer distinguish if it was real or a product of my own fear. I stumbled, falling to my knees. Everything was dark, disoriented. I was lost, utterly and completely lost. With my breath heavy and heart pounding, I lay on the ground, listening and wondering if I was indeed going insane. I closed my eye. The silence was the worst of all. The tapping stopped, the rustling ceased. I finally felt alone, and even that knowledge felt terrifying. I opened one eye, and then the other, and the only image I could see was that of the ceiling of that old camp building. The dark eye sockets of the window, staring directly at me. Only, they were no longer windows. They were faces. Story 14. The moss felt strangely soft under my boots. Not the usual hard, brittle stuff you find clinging to rocks, but a thick, spongy carpet that yielded with a disconcerting squish under every step. I'd veered off the marked trail, just a little, drawn in by the unusual quiet. The jungle, even at its most serene, always had a hum, a constant chorus of insects. But here, in this small pocket between the towering trees, everything was muted. Even the rustle of the wind through the canopy seemed distant, as though the air itself was thick and heavy. I was in a different area of the park today, a place called Whispering Paths on the map, though I'd yet to hear any whispers. It was supposed to be less dense, more open than the Blackwood section I usually explore, but that didn't seem right either. The trees were packed tight as always, old, gnarly things reaching for the sky like grasping hands. The light was filtered, creating a strange, almost underwater effect. I pushed past a curtain of vines, their leaves slick with moisture, and a feeling, cold and unwelcome, settled over me. Not a chill from the air, but something deeper, like the jungle itself was drawing away, becoming aware of my presence. I continued deeper, my boots making soft, muffled noises in the moss. I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of white that didn't seem to fit into the surrounding colors. I turned my head slowly and looked. It was a small bone, bleached and stark against the dark green, half buried in the moss. I crouched to look closer. Not an animal bone, I thought. Too smooth, too rounded at the end. I had seen bones like these in pictures at the park's office. Human. The ones that had been found after people had gone missing. My heart did a little skip. I stood slowly and scanned the area, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. I took a breath and slowly moved on. The feeling of unease grew, shifting from a low hum to something sharper. I found an old path, overgrown and barely visible, running along a dry stream bed. I followed it for a while. The path seemed to twist, leading me further from the main trails, further into the silent core of the forest. I tried to focus on the sounds, scanning for any of the usual signs of life. Bird song, the monkeys chattering, nothing. Just the rhythmic squish of my steps and the occasional drip of water from the canopy. I checked my watch and then my GPS. I had about 2 hours of sun left before it would start to get dark. I reached a small clearing, and in the center I saw a structure. It was made of old, weathered wood, more a haphazard collection of planks than an actual building. Its roof was collapsed, and the whole thing slumped into the earth, looking like it had been pulled down into the soil by unseen hands. I approached it slowly, each step feeling as heavy as lead. The wood felt damp and cold. I couldn't see any marks on the outside, no doors, no windows, just a shadowy hole at one end, a mouth inviting me in. I couldn't help myself. I knew I should turn away, but instead I continued to move towards it. I felt a sense of dread and curiosity pulling me forward. The air around the structure seemed to thicken. I could almost taste it, a strange, metallic flavor on my tongue. The light was even more subdued here, the shadows deeper, as if they were feeding on the remaining sunlight. I reached the opening and peeked in. Inside was blacker. There was a musty smell of decaying wood and something else, something damp and earthy. I felt my breath quicken. I needed to go. I moved to turn back, but I couldn't. I took another step towards it, then another. My feet moved almost against my will, drawn by an invisible force. I stepped over the threshold. The darkness enveloped me, pressing in on all sides. I couldn't see more than a foot in front of my face. The air inside was still, thick and heavy, and the smell was oppressive, sweet and rotten all at once. I reached out my hand in front of me to find my way. My fingers brushed against something soft and smooth, something that gave slightly under my touch. I jerked my hand back. Whatever it was, it felt wrong. I turned to go. I could feel my heart beating madly, pounding against my chest. I took another step back, another away from the mystery of the structure. But the opening was gone. I turned my head in all directions. I went to where I thought it was. I knew I had only walked a few small steps, but it was just a wall of the same damp wood, closed and all around. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. No signal. I tried to flick on my head torch, but that wasn't working either. I felt panic rise within me. Everything was dark and I was trapped. I continued to run my hands along the wall of wood. I could feel the softness of the wood, but each section was the same. No opening, no door. I started to feel a sense of claustrophobia, like the very walls of this strange place were closing in. I wanted to scream, but found I couldn't make a sound. I had no idea what time it was. I didn't know how long I had been in this darkness. Had it always been dark? I started to pace. I continued to walk the circumference of the space. I continued to walk the circumference of the space, each section of wood feeling the same cold, damp, dead feeling. I started to get lightheaded. Then I noticed the section seemed slightly different. There was a slight dip in the wood, a small dent. I moved closer and touched it again. The wood gave slightly. It was softer than the rest, almost like flesh. I brought my hand up and smelled it. The smell of the damp earth mixed with the metallic tinge made me gag. This was not wood. It felt like skin, and it smelled like death. I started to pull my hands back quickly. I wanted to get out of this space. I needed to get out of this space. My breaths became shorter, quicker. I started to panic. I ran my hand over the spot again, pushing into the dent as if something else was underneath. The wood gave way. Suddenly I was falling, not falling down, but falling forward, through the wall and back into the light. I scrambled to my hands and knees. I didn't know where I was, but it was no longer that awful dark space. I got onto my feet. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The clearing looked different, unfamiliar. I couldn't see the structure anymore. It had disappeared. I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion. I took a deep breath. I needed to get back to the main trail. I turned and ran. The jungle seemed to press in, the sounds of the evening starting to rise. But there was a new sound now, an undercurrent to the usual chorus. A soft, rhythmic thumping, a sound that seemed to resonate in my chest. I picked up my pace, moving faster through the trees. The thumping became louder, closer, and I realized it was coming from behind me. I glanced back, but the thick trees blocked my view. I continued to run, my breath becoming ragged. I didn't know how long I'd been running, or where I was. All sense of direction was lost. I had no idea what was behind me, or if there was even anything there at all. But the sound continued, a relentless, slow beating, and it showed no sign of stopping. It felt like it was getting closer. Then, I stumbled. I had tripped over a tree root, and my ankle buckled. I fell hard. I lay there, catching my breath, but something was right behind me now. I didn't dare to turn around, my eyes locked on the ground in front of me, but it was getting closer. Then I heard it. They weren't footsteps. They were dragging, slow, deliberate dragging, like a weight was being pulled through the undergrowth towards me, each drag closer. I shut my eyes. I didn't open them again. Story 15. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not just any quiet, but the kind that presses on your eardrums. The kind that makes the small rustle of your own clothes sound like a shout. I was at the edge of the Danum Valley Conservation Area in Borneo, a place I dreamt of visiting for years. I wasn't here for vacation, exactly. I was here for research, studying the effects of deforestation on local insect populations. But even before I'd set up my traps, the quiet had sunk into me. The air felt thick, not just humid, but heavy, like it was full of something I couldn't quite grasp. The light filtering through the dense canopy was strange, too, muted and greenish, almost like being underwater. It wasn't the vibrant, sun-drenched jungle I'd imagined. This place felt old, ancient, even. My research base was a small clearing, a cluster of tents, and a rickety wooden table. The team had already left for the day, deeper into the forest, setting up camera traps. I was alone, which as a seasoned field researcher, I didn't mind usually. But here, solitude felt different. I started unpacking, running through my pre-trip checklists. It was a methodical, almost comforting process, but the shadows seemed to stretch and deepen as I worked. The periphery of my vision playing tricks, a sudden stillness, like the world holding its breath, made me pause. For a beat, I thought I'd heard something. A whisper of sound that wasn't an animal or wind, or even my own breathing. I dismissed it, chalking it up to nerves and the strangeness of the place. I got on with my work, marking out grids for my insect traps, using small wooden stakes and bright orange twine. I walked a small circular area away from the camp, feeling the undergrowth crunch beneath my boots, and placed the traps methodically. Later, as the lights started to fade, I returned to my tent. The air had grown cooler, the green light of the day changing to a deep, bruised purple that pushed the shadows into sharp relief. It was then that I noticed something else. The smell, the faint, metallic tang, like old blood, began to waft from the forest. It clung to the air, making my stomach churn. I couldn't place it, but it felt wrong, unnatural. The sound seemed to be changing, too. The insect chorus, which had been a constant background buzz, became sporadic, almost hesitant. The usual chorus of jungle life was fractured, broken. It felt as if even the natural world was afraid. I tried to shake off the unease. I prepared a simple meal on my camping stove, forcing myself to focus on the practical tasks. But the smell lingered, the shadows deepened, and that unsettling quiet was broken by the occasional snap of a twig just outside the small clearing. Each sound made my heart pound a little harder. I started to keep a log, to record my observations of the insect populations. But as I jotted down notes, my hand felt shaky. I found myself writing about the changing light, the strange smells, the unnerving quiet, almost as much as my research. The lines blurred on the page, my scientific observations blending with these strange feelings. I tried to read, hoping to calm my nerves, but the letters danced on the page. I could feel the eyes of the jungle, unseen, pressing upon me. The feeling was overwhelming, a suffocating sense of being watched. I felt a pressure, almost a weight, on my chest. Sleep was fitful. I kept waking up, heart racing, to the slightest sounds of rustling leaves, or the distant hoot of an owl. Each time I opened my eyes, the shadows seemed darker, tighter, like the forest was slowly creeping into the tent itself. The next morning I woke to the same oppressive quiet. The metallic smell was still there, just fainter it seemed, and it stuck at the back of my nose. It was a lingering, uncomfortable scent. I felt heavy, like I hadn't slept at all. The team returned, full of their own stories of their trek and camera findings. I felt a sense of relief at their chatter and presence. I tried to brush off my unease, telling myself it was just my imagination, the result of being alone in this remote place. But I knew there was more to it than that. We packed up, ready to move to a new location, closer to the river, and I was thankful to leave the clearing. It felt as if I was escaping from something rather than moving onwards with my research. The location was marked as Research Base Number 2 on the map. This location was beside the river. The sound seemed to be louder, the air colder, and the light seemed different. It was a wider space, less dense than Base 1. It was a wider space, less dense than Base 1. The feeling was still there, and a chill went through me. As we set up camp, I watched the team. Their chat sounded hollow and distant, and I could feel the weight of the forest closing in again. I walked to the edge of the clearing and gazed at the river. The water was black, still, and deep. The trees on the opposite bank seemed to stare back with eyes in the darkness of their branches. The current was slow, almost lazy, but you could feel the power beneath the surface. I saw a wooden carving on the bank. It looked old, weathered, and hand-carved. The carving was of a person, an old type of face, looking up into the sky with large, rounded eyes. I felt drawn to it and put my hand out to touch it, then quickly snatched my hand back like I had been burned. I could feel my skin tingle from where I had nearly touched it. Later that day, the team were doing their own thing while I rearranged my research data on the table. I glanced up and could see them in my eye line. I watched them, and they started to fade like a mirage. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. They were back. I looked away, then back again, and the whole team had gone. I started to panic. They had only been there seconds ago. I began calling out, not shouting but a loud call, in the hope they would hear me. I waited and called again and again, then shouted louder. And still nothing. I could only hear the river and the forest. The sounds of the jungle had disappeared again, leaving that heavy silence. I picked up my radio to call for help, but there was no signal, just static. The radio buzzed and crackled as I tried again and again. I went to my tent and ripped through the bag to find the emergency satellite phone. I pulled it out, turned it on, and then heard the dial tone. I quickly punched in the emergency number and waited for the call to connect. Instead of a ring, I heard a high-pitched whine, like electricity. It grew louder and louder until I slammed the phone down onto the table. This is when I saw the figure in the trees. It was tall, thin, and dark, like a shadow cut out of the forest itself. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any features, only a darkness that seemed denser than the shadows around it. I stared at it, frozen. It remained still, like it was waiting for something. I turned around and ran, not to the tents, not to where my team had been a few moments ago, but in the other direction, away from the clearing, away from the river. I plowed through the undergrowth, not caring about the thorns and low-hanging branches that whipped across my face. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The image of that figure stood stationary in the trees stayed in my head. The forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, thick and dark, became a blur as I ran blindly onwards. I tripped and fell, scraping my knees, and lay there, trying to catch my breath. I looked backwards to see if the figure was still there, but I could see nothing. The forest was silent again. I stood up and continued running. I had no idea where I was, or what I was running to, or from. All I knew was I needed to get away, needed to escape the weight, the presence that had set in around me. I just kept running, each breath becoming a desperate gasp, until I just couldn't run anymore. I hope I can get out of here. Story 16. The weight of the backpack was a familiar ache across my shoulders. Each step through the undergrowth was a conscious effort, the leafy floor sucking at my boots. I've been tracking this rare orchid for weeks now. A delicate white bloom rumored to grow only near the old logging trails, deep within the fringes of the serpent's spine. That's what the locals called this part. The less visited part of Blackwood Forest, a place they avoided. And it wasn't for the normal reasons of spiders and snakes. The air hung heavy, not with humidity this time, but with a sort of stillness that had a weight to it, like something was holding its breath. It was just after midday, I reckoned, the sun a pale disk struggling to pierce the dense canopy. I'd taken to looking at the time less and less. I found it was better if I just went with it now. The clock was different out here. It was different everywhere there was nature like this. But even here, the light was unnaturally dim, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift, even when the trees didn't. I wasn't new to this. I tracked plants down in far worse places. But I was new to this place, this part of the forest, and there was something, some unnerving undercurrent that I couldn't quite place. I pushed through a tangle of vines, their tendrils cold and clammy against my skin. The logging trail was just ahead, not even a track anymore, just a faint scar on the earth, a line of stunted, unhappy-looking plants. I could see broken wood, old, rotted, fallen logs, half devoured by moss and fungus, scattered like fallen giants along the path. I paused, taking a swig of water from my canteen. The silence was absolute now. Not a bird call, not even the hum of insects. Just the thudding of my own heart and the rustle of my movement. I should have been annoyed. I mean, that's the sign, usually. A great sign when there is very little noise. It's why I do it, why I come to these far-out places. I continued along the faint trail, my eyes scanning the edges of the pathway. I knew that the orchid was a ground-dwelling type, so I kept my gazes low, focusing on shadows beneath and around the large trees. I was trying to focus on the task at hand. I had seen some things here and there these last few weeks. Nothing I couldn't easily excuse away. Not really. But sometimes, it was better just to look down in front of you. And then I saw it. The first one. A single white bloom, almost translucent, set against the dark earth. It was exactly as described. A delicate, almost ethereal thing that seemed to glow faintly. It wasn't alone. Along the edge of the trail, more bloomed, a cluster of maybe half a dozen, all perfectly formed, untouched by any blight or decay. The air around them felt different, a bit colder, maybe. My fingers fumbled in my bag for all my lens and camera bits, and I started snapping away at the flowers. I was so focused on the photography, I hadn't even noticed a change. The light had shifted. Or had it? The sun was still somewhere in the sky, but where it had been a pale, dim light, it was now a sort of reddish hue, filtered through the canopy. It wasn't the time. I didn't check the time, but I knew it wasn't that time. A new shadow had also appeared. A large one. right behind the largest tree trunk in the area. A tree that hadn't been there previously. It wasn't the shadow of the tree. I knew that. It was a different shadow. Darker, thicker, more solid. I stopped taking pictures, trying to keep my breathing calm. And I watched it. Not a shadow anymore, but an absence of light. A void that didn't belong. I packed my camera gear up quickly. The flowers seemed less appealing now, and I tried to retrace back the trail, back in the direction I came in. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prick up. The stillness of the forest turned oppressive. It wasn't just silence anymore. It felt like something was watching me, something large, something inhuman. I could hear something shifting behind me too. It was subtle, but it was there. Like branches were moving without any wind. I kept my head down, trying to stay calm, but my steps were getting faster now, almost bordering on a run. The canopy above seemed to thicken, the red light becoming deeper, almost blood-like. The trail I had just come down was gone. The trees now looked wrong, their shapes distorted and unfamiliar. I was in the same area for sure, but that area wasn't right. The tree that had just been a tree was now a gnarled thing, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The air felt heavy, thick, and I could feel my breathing getting heavier too. Panic started to set in, and every shadow seemed to hold a hidden form. I tried to remember how I came, but it was gone. All of it, just gone. I kept walking, not trying to find the trail anymore, just to keep moving, trying to get away from that place and the thing, or whatever it was. Every now and then, I could hear the strange rustling behind me move further left, or further right, as if it was moving around, trying to flank me. It wasn't just the trees either. Bushes would rustle, even the ground under my feet creaked, but something that wasn't connected to my steps. I wasn't being followed by one thing. It felt like I was being surrounded. I finally came to a small clearing, a small outcrop where the trees seemed to clear for a short while, with big broken rocks scattered about. I moved to the middle of the space, turning to look all around me. It was darker now. The light was almost gone, and I started to feel cold, very cold. The rustling behind me seemed to stop, and the stillness returned to the place. It was more than stillness now. It was a void. The air felt like it was being sucked away somehow. Then I heard it, a low growl, almost a rumble, coming from somewhere in the trees. It was deep, guttural, and not like any animal I'd ever heard. I started walking, trying to find the edge of the clearing, desperate to be anywhere but there. I could feel a presence closing in. That feeling like something was watching me was now closer, and I could feel it now with my skin. I tripped, hitting the ground hard, dropping my bag and everything. As I turned to pick something up, I could see something in the corner of my eye, something tall, lean, and dark, moving away from the trees. I stayed still, just stayed still. My heart was racing, and I didn't want to attract attention to myself. Slowly, I picked up my things, my heart pounding. I could feel more than see it. The presence right there, right on the edge of the clearing. Time slowed. I closed my eyes, took the deepest breath I could, and started to walk, slowly, towards where I thought was the edge of the clearing. I didn't want to run. If that was the game they were playing, then that was the game I would play. I walked, slowly and slowly. I opened my eyes, and I was on the edge of the clearing. I looked around. No trees, no rocks. Just the dense wall of trees that I knew was the true jungle. The deep blackness of the forest looked almost welcoming after what I'd just been through. I didn't look back. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, and didn't stop until I could hear the familiar sounds of life again. Insects, birds, even the gentle rustle of the wind. I was out. But I knew that whatever I had seen or felt in that small patch of woods wasn't going to leave me. I knew I'd be going back. I had to, and I knew that when I did, I wouldn't be alone. Story 17. The path was barely there, just a snaking suggestion through the undergrowth. Sunlight, already weak, struggled to reach the forest floor, leaving everything in shades of moss and shadow. I've been tracking this strange anomaly, a series of seemingly unexplainable compass deviations, for days now. Not like the usual magnetic interference you get from mineral deposits. This felt different. It pulled, it warped, and the closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air, thick and heavy, smelled of damp earth and something else, almost metallic, like old blood. It wasn't overpowering, just a lingering note that made my stomach clench. My hiking boots sank into the soft ground with each step. The only sound other than the hum of insects, a sound that seemed to be getting louder, more intense. I glanced at my watch, 1:37 p.m. Time to push on, but not for too long. I passed a clearing, or what I thought was a clearing. The trees had all but fallen away, but the dense growth had been replaced by a thicket of thorny bushes that seemed to twist and writhe, reaching out like skeletal fingers. There wasn't a single bird call, not an animal scurrying through the leaves, just a heavy silence that seemed to press down on me. I took a few more steps into this open space. The ground here felt different, almost spongy, as though there was something beneath the ground. My compass, usually a reliable friend, was spinning wildly again, its needle not even trying to find north. I pressed on, moving closer to the center of this space. There was a rock in the center, flat, almost like a table. I moved towards it, and as I got closer, I could see that there was an indentation, almost like a handprint. I touched the indent and instantly something shoots up my arm. It felt cold and heavy, and almost like electricity, but not quite. I shook my head, nothing. Must have been the heat. I pulled out my water bottle and took a sip. I have to make this last. I continued deeper, the clearing stretching further than I had expected. It was like a huge hole cut in the jungle floor, but not like normal. The trees, instead of being cut or ripped, were pulled away or bent, like they had grown like that. It seemed like the very forest was recoiling from this area, like it was sick. The compass was no longer even twitching. I thought about turning back, but something was drawing me in. I knew this feeling. I had come too far, and the daylight was waning. I'll try and find my way back before dark. I reached another space, similar to the first, but this one had a pit in the middle. I was very careful not to get too close, as the edge looked unstable. This one was deeper than the first. I took a wide berth around it. My pace quickened now. I found myself jogging, and I was getting slightly out of breath. I must make it back. I kept moving through the jungle. It was getting hard to see now as the sun was starting to set. The sky through the top of the trees was going from orange to purple. I pushed through some more bushes when I found myself in a cave. I like the caves I'm used to. This was like a small opening that just kept going. I pulled my head torch from my bag as this was the first time I had needed it. A small light illuminated the stone walls. They were smooth, almost too smooth. I stepped in, and the smell hit me. This one was stronger. The same metallic scent, but richer, deeper. It was accompanied by something almost sweet, like decaying fruit mixed with rust. I pushed on slightly, not going too deep, but deep enough that I could no longer see the trees. The walls continued to be smooth, like someone had spent time polishing them. There were strange carvings on one of the walls, symbols that I didn't recognize. I was starting to get a headache, a heavy throbbing around my temples. I took a couple of steps back, and my foot hit something. I shone the light down. It was a bone. It looked human. My heart started to pound in my ears. This wasn't good. I quickly turned around and walked straight back out. I was starting to panic now. I pushed through the jungle, trying to remember the path that I took. But it was like the jungle was changing around me. Nothing was the same. I pushed through some more bushes when I found myself back in the clearing with the two spaces. I didn't understand it. How could I be back here? Something wasn't right. I looked around. It was almost completely dark now, but I could still see the spaces. There was something about them, something unnerving. The heavy silence was back, and I felt more alone than ever before. I looked up through the trees. It was dark now. I was going to have to settle down with what little light I had. I pulled out my small camping tent and set it up. I pulled out my small camp stove and heated up some water. I made myself a small meal. Trying not to panic was getting harder. I kept having the feeling that I was being watched. I then zipped the tent up and tried to get some sleep. I laid there, listening to the jungle, every small creak and rustle. I slowly managed to fall asleep. I woke up, not sure what time it was, but I could tell it was still dark. I unzipped the tent to look out, and that's when I saw them. In the center of the first space, standing perfectly still, were figures. They seemed to be watching me. My heart stopped. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my hands trembling. I closed my eyes and put my hands over my ears. I didn't want to see or hear them, but I could still feel them. Still felt like I was being watched. My breathing was shallow and short. I spent the rest of the night in that tent, never opening it again. I woke up to sunlight hitting the material. I slowly unzipped it and looked out. Nothing was there. It all seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. I quickly packed up my gear and walked, or ran. I didn't really care. I pushed past everything, back the way I thought I had come, but no matter which way I went, I always seemed to find myself back there, at the clearing, over and over. It was like it was playing with me. I spent days like this, always back at that place, never able to get out. I don't know how long I've been here. I had lost track. My food and water ran out a while ago. I was getting weaker. I don't know what's happening to me, but I know I won't make it out. I know they're watching. Story 18. The weight of the air in the Kakamega forest settled on my shoulders. The instant I stepped out of the truck. Not the usual humid stickiness, but a heavy, damp blanket that seemed to press against me. It was early morning, the sun barely managing to filter through the dense canopy above. I was here for a research trip, cataloging the local flora, something I'd done dozens of times in various parts of the world. This place, though, it felt different. I set up my base camp, a small tent and a portable table with my gear. The sounds were almost overwhelming at first. A chorus of unseen life. It wasn't a pleasant symphony, though. More like a constant, rustling chatter punctuated with sharp, piercing calls. I started my work, focusing on the plants, trying not to let the surrounding wilderness affect me. I carefully collected samples, filling out my notebooks with details. The hours passed, the sun climbing higher, then slowly dipping again, painting the forest in long, distorted shadows. I ate a cold meal, the forest growing increasingly silent as the light faded. Then the sounds began again, sharper now, clearer, as if they were closing in. I tried ignoring it, telling myself it was the natural progression of the day. The feeling of being watched grew. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes trying to pierce the deepening gloom, but saw nothing. I wrapped up work, packing everything securely into the tent. Sleep was a slow fight. Every tiny rustle, every snap of a branch sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. It felt like something was moving just outside the tent, circling slowly. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the thin fabric, picturing what might be on the other side. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next day, I decided to move deeper into the forest. I packed everything up, noticing on the way that the plants seemed to have odd patches of decay, even those that were otherwise lush and healthy. A slight smell of something rotting in the air. As I trekked further in, the trees started to take on strange shapes, their limbs gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers reaching out. The forest floor became uneven, almost like it was swallowing my boots with each step. The light became more scarce, the thick foliage blocking out most of the sunlight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming the prey, a small creature caught in a vast hunter's domain. I took my time, carefully noting the species in this deeper section, a different mix from the areas by the camp. But when I stopped, the silence felt heavier, more present when it was there. I noticed a pattern of broken twigs, not random, but almost deliberately placed. These didn't look like an animal's doing. I was alone, I knew that. It felt like someone was marking the path. I didn't like it. I hurried back to my base, noticing the sun was already beginning to set. I found my camp to be undisturbed, but the air felt heavier. I ate dinner quietly, the forest sounds seeming to echo louder in the gathering dark. As I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, I heard a soft dragging sound, like something being pulled along the ground. It was slow and deliberate. It stayed just outside the edges of my camp, as if circling me. This time, no exhaustion came. I lay awake, trying not to move, wanting it to end, wanting whatever is out there gone. Eventually, the dragging sound stopped. I waited, my breathing shallow and careful. When I opened my eyes, the fabric was gray with the beginnings of dawn. A sense of urgency rose in me, and I felt I couldn't stay anymore. I packed up camp as fast as I could, not bothering to be careful. The feeling of being watched was palpable, the forest seeming to close in on me. I knew I had to get out of here. The walk back felt different. The trees looked more menacing, the shadows darker. I kept glancing behind, almost expecting to see something. But there was just the forest. I moved quickly, my heart racing with each step. Finally, I saw the clearing where my truck waited. I practically ran the last stretch, throwing my gear inside, jumped in and started the engine the second I was in. I didn't look back. I drove away, the image of the forest imprinted in my mind. The twisting trees, the feeling of being watched, the strange dragging sound. I knew I would never forget this trip. I didn't know what was out there, and I didn't want to. I was just happy to be free of it, and not to see the place again. As I drove, I started to feel as though I had left something behind, as though there was a part of me still in that forest. I was suddenly certain there were things there, and I didn't want to know what. Story 19. The thick green canopy of the Amazon felt like a living thing, pressing down from all sides. It wasn't the oppressive heat I noticed first, but the silence. A strange, heavy silence that seemed to swallow all other noise. I'd spent the past week trekking solo through this part of Brazil, a research assistant on a grant, tracking bird migration patterns. This wasn't my first foray into the jungle. But this time, something felt different. The initial days had been almost idyllic. Sunlight dappled through the leaves. Parrots screamed their vibrant calls, and the air hummed with the constant buzz of insects. I followed my GPS and meticulously took notes, feeling a sense of peaceful solitude. I'd even managed to get some fantastic photos of the elusive Hudson. But as I moved deeper, further from the river, the atmosphere started to shift. The vibrant sounds faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet. that made the rustling of leaves sound like whispered secrets. It started subtly. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. I had stopped to transcribe notes, and a shiver would run down my spine, as though eyes were boring into the back of my neck. I'd spin around, scanning the dense undergrowth with my binoculars. But there was never anything there, just the interlocking branches and long, hanging vines. I brushed it off, blaming my overactive imagination, the isolation, and the fact I hadn't slept properly in days. The feeling intensified as I ventured beyond the established trails. I found myself in an area where trees grew unusually tall and close together, their branches forming a dark, almost impenetrable roof. The sunlight barely touched the forest floor, creating an eternal twilight. It wasn't just the lack of light that bothered me, it was the shapes the shadows took. They shifted and elongated in the periphery of my vision, seeming to coalesce into grotesque forms before dissolving back into darkness. I began double-checking the path I was taking, certain I hadn't walked those ways before, that the turns weren't where my map said they should be. One day I stumbled across a clearing. It was small, perfectly circular, and the ground was unnaturally bare and compacted. In the center, embedded flush into the earth, was a stone. Not just any stone, but a large flat slab of black material that didn't resemble any of the natural rock formations I'd seen. It was completely smooth, with no markings or imperfections. The air around it was cold, a noticeable drop against the heavy, humid environment. I touched it with the tip of my boot, a strange, tingling sensation running through my leg. I took some pictures, a little unnerved by the stark contrast of the black stone against the surrounding green. That night, sleeping in my hammock, the sounds came. Not the familiar jungle noises, but whispers, faint, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to swirl around me. I strained to hear, trying to make out words, but they remained just elusive murmurs, like the wind passing through reeds. I told myself it was just the leaves brushing against each other, my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the unease kept me tossing and turning, the whispering continuing until dawn. I started to notice things out of place, things that shouldn't have been there. A single, perfectly round black feather lying on a bed of bright green moss. A small, intricately woven basket hanging from the branch of a tree, far too high for anyone to have placed there naturally. It was like someone or something was leaving little marks of their presence. The feeling of being watched was no longer a flicker. It was a constant, suffocating pressure. The GPS became unreliable, directing me in circles until it finally just stopped working. My compass spun wildly, completely disoriented. I consulted my paper maps, but the paths and clearings no longer matched my surroundings. The trees seemed to shift around me, changing their shapes and forms. It wasn't just confusing. It was like the landscape was actively trying to disorient me, to confuse me, to keep me lost. I retraced my steps back towards what I thought was a familiar area, only to find that the small stream I'd used as a landmark had vanished. The jungle had folded into itself, rearranged its geography. Panic began to claw at the edges of my calm. I tried to keep my wits about me, to focus on the basic survival rules I had learned. I ate what little food remained, and drank sparingly from my water supply. But survival became secondary to just trying to understand what was happening. One morning I woke to find small marks scored into the bark of the trees around my campsite. Not random scratches, but almost glyph-like, in repeating patterns. The marks were new. They hadn't been there the night before. As I approached them, the familiar coldness returned to me, the same I had felt by the black stone. Looking closer, I realized that the marks were not carved in the bark. They were burnt into it, the wood dry and slightly charred. The whispers became constant. They wove themselves into the rustling of leaves, the drone of insects, making it hard to distinguish between what was real And what was in my head? It was more like a low hum now, surrounding me, a constant pressure on my psyche. I had the terrifying feeling that I was no longer alone, and that what was with me was waiting. I tried to force myself to think logically. I was in the jungle. I had probably just gotten lost, and I was letting my fear get the best of me. I tried the radio, but the static was deafening. I tried to make a fire, but the wood smoked and refused to catch. It was then that I broke, realizing that there was something more here. Something unexplainable. Something hostile. I packed up what little gear I had left and scrambled away, back into the deeper heart of the trees, unsure of where I was going, only knowing that I needed to move. I didn't know what was in the jungle, but I felt it all around me. It was in the shadows, the whispers, the cold spaces, and the feeling that things were not quite right. I don't think I'll ever truly understand what happened to me these past few weeks. I only know that I made it out. Barely, and I cannot escape the sensation that something went back with me. Something that I had brought out of the jungle and into my life. The whispers are quieter now, but they haven't gone away, and sometimes I see shadows that move when they shouldn't. Story 20. The drive was long, the kind that bleeds the color out of everything. Dust devils danced in the rearview mirror as I pulled off the cracked asphalt onto the dirt track leading into the heart of what they called the Emerald Maze. That's what the locals called it, not the official name for the national park. Emerald Maze felt more accurate, though. There was an oppressive greenness to it all, the kind that swallowed sunlight and seemed to hum with secrets. I'd come to this part of Borneo on a hunch, a whisper of a rumor about the disappearances. Not just the well-documented ones, the eco-tourists who got lost, or the loggers who vanished without a trace, but little whispers. The ones whispered low in village huts and ignored by officials. The stories of those who went into the Emerald Maze, and something else came back. The air hung thick and heavy, not humid. Not exactly, but weighted down somehow. The smell was earthy, a mix of decaying leaves and something acrid, like burnt sugar, that clawed at the back of my throat. I unpacked the gear slowly. Sturdy boots, a pack filled with essentials, and my compass, a relic handed down through my family, each mark worn smooth as glass. It felt right here, somehow. This old tool in the ancient jungle, the digital tech felt out of place, like a tiny, buzzing insect amidst a symphony of hidden things. The first few hours were uneventful. Just the constant drone of cicadas and the soft padding of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. The light filtered down in dappled patterns, creating an illusion of constant movement. Shadows stretching and shrinking like they had their own kind of life. I passed clusters of bizarre fungi, some bioluminescent with a faint, sickly green glow, casting an unearthly light on the forest floor. I decided to make camp at the base of a giant tualang tree. It was an ancient beast, its immense roots like a gnarled network of veins. The air here was different, colder than I'd expected. As darkness crept in, the sounds of the jungle changed. The usual daytime buzz gave way to rustlings and clicks, things that scurried in the underbrush, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth. I lit a small fire, the dancing flames carving out a temporary circle of light against an abyss of darkness. The first unsettling thing was the way the firelight seemed to bend itself, as if something was breathing just beyond its reach. Shadows elongated and twisted, mimicking shapes I couldn't quite decipher. A branch would crack somewhere far off, and my head would snap around, but there'd be nothing there. I tried to rationalize it, blame it on the tricks of the darkness, but the hair on my arms stood on end. The next day, I pushed deeper, leaving the faint track behind. The forest felt closer now, as if it were pressing in on me. The trees grew taller, their canopies interlocking to create an almost impenetrable dome above. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, and the air felt thick and cloying, like a damp shroud. I came across the remains of a camp, not a recent one, judging by the decaying canvas of a tent and the rusting cooking pot. There were bones scattered around, cleaned bare by the jungle scavengers. Animal bones, I told myself, but there was something human-like in the way they were arranged. A strange, purposeful pattern that made my stomach churn. I didn't linger, my pace quickening, a cold knot of fear forming in my chest. The trees grew closer, the undergrowth forming a suffocating wall all around me. The humming sound from the night before was back too, this time closer, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate through the bones in my chest, a low thrum that set my teeth on edge. Something was out there, and I had the sickening feeling that it was aware of my presence. I started to see things in my peripheral vision. A flash of movement, the shadow of something tall, slithering between the trees. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. The jungle was playing tricks on me, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if it was teasing me, luring me further into its embrace. I tried to focus on the compass, the needle spinning wildly, as if lost itself. Then, I found the clearing. It was unlike anything else I'd witnessed in the jungle. A perfect circle, with no undergrowth, just bare earth. At its center stood a single massive stone, covered in strange carvings that seemed to writhe as I looked at them. The humming noise was at its peak here, almost deafening. The air was thick with the smell of burnt sugar, intensified tenfold. I felt a pressure in my head, a terrible bone-deep ache, like something was trying to burrow inside me. The images flashed before my eyes, like broken shards of glass, faces contorted in terror, limbs twisting in grotesque angles, the terrible hollow stares of eyes that no longer belonged to the living. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture what I saw, or what I thought I saw. My hands would not obey. They were trembling, useless, as waves of nausea crashed over me. I collapsed to my knees. The jungle went silent. The humming stopped. The images faded. Only the blood pounding in my ears. It was a false reprieve. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the forest itself was watching, waiting. I stumbled back away from the clearing, each step agonizing. The trees seemed to lean in towards me, as if trying to grab at me, to pull me further into their embrace. The shadows stretched and shifted, no longer just shadows, but something else. Something with substance to them. I don't know if it was hours or days, but I kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to escape. I didn't feel like myself anymore. I was just a collection of frayed nerves, a racing heart, and trembling limbs. The world had become something alien, a place of endless shadows and impossible sounds, where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred beyond recognition. I found a dirt track just before dawn, the first rays of sunlight bleeding through the canopy. It was enough to feel almost human, almost sane. But the silence of the jungle followed me out, a cold and knowing weight that pressed down on my soul. I left the emerald maze behind, not looking back, knowing that whatever lurked within would remain there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too deep. And I knew, with utter dread, that a piece of it had come out with me. The taste of burnt sugar was still on the back of my tongue, and the memory of those shapes in the shadows still danced at the edges of my vision. Story 21. The sticky heat clung to me like a second skin as I adjusted the strap of my pack. Not the kind of heat that makes you sweat, but the kind that seems to seep into your bones, making you feel slightly nauseous. They called it the Emerald Labyrinth, this stretch of jungle on the border of Guyana and Brazil. Too dramatic if you ask me. It was just trees, really. a dense green wall that swallowed the light and muffled every sound. I wasn't here for the poetry, though. I was here for work. I'm a cartographer, or at least I used to be. Now I'm more of a map fixer. When old maps clash with reality, when routes disappear, that's where I come in. Someone paid me to find a trail, an old prospector's route, apparently. That was marked on an early 20th century survey, but that no one had seen since. Simple enough, I figured. The first week was uneventful. The jungle was just itself. Humid, full of screaming insects and the occasional flash of bright-colored birds. I followed the coordinates, mostly compass work, occasionally verifying by satellite. The old route took me deeper into the dense foliage, a narrow, weaving tunnel of leaves and vines. The air grew heavy, the ground damp and soft under my hiking boots. The trees loomed taller, their trunks thicker than any I'd ever seen. The sunlight barely reached the floor, casting long, dancing shadows that made the jungle look like a living, breathing entity. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual cacophony of insects had faded a bit, leaving a low drone, a vibration more than a sound. I started to notice a strange smell, like damp earth, and something metallic, like rust. It was faint, but persistent, clinging to the air. Then, I found the ruins. Not stone, like you'd expect, but wooden structures. The remains of huts, mostly rotted away, buried under a thick layer of moss and vines. It looked like a small abandoned village. This wasn't on the old maps. There were pieces of metal scattered around, warped and corroded. Cooking pots, parts of tools. The wood felt brittle, almost weightless. I didn't touch anything. It felt wrong, somehow, like disturbing a gravesite. That night, the jungle felt different. The shadows seemed to move on their own, detached from the source of light, like they had their own will. I was camped near the ruins, trying to sleep in my hammock, but every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I heard a sound, low and guttural, like a moan, or the wind whistling through a cave. But there was no wind. It came from just outside the perimeter of my camp. The next day, I moved on, deeper into the jungle, trying to follow the old route. I found strange markings carved into the trees. A spiral, a cross, a series of dots, symbols that looked almost like a language, or maybe something older. They were everywhere, in clusters, like the trees were communicating. The smell had intensified, that mix of damp earth and metal. I started noticing that the vegetation was different in the areas with the carvings. The leaves were darker, almost black in places, and they had a strange, waxy feel to them. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around quickly, but there was never anything there. Just the silent trees and the oppressive heat. I came across another set of ruins. This one was different. It was built into a small clearing. There was a circle of stones, and in the center, a strange altar. A flat slab of rock with more of those strange symbols carved into it. The air here was heavy, viscous, and the smell was almost overpowering. I felt a cold dread wash over me, a deep, primal fear that went beyond anything logical. I started to notice changes within myself. I was becoming increasingly exhausted, even though I was eating and drinking. My mind felt fuzzy, like walking through a thick fog. I'd sometimes forget why I was walking, until I remembered my map and the route carved into the trees. The jungle had a way of making you forget what you were even doing, what you were here for. Everything felt dull and distant. One evening, as the last vestiges of daylight seeped away, I saw it. Or I thought I saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall, thin, and pale. It was gone in an instant, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The sounds outside my camp grew more insistent, the moans and guttural noises closer, like something was circling me. I stopped using my flashlight at night, relying instead on the dim glow of the moon. I became hyper-aware of every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I found more ruins, deeper into the jungle than I thought possible. These weren't huts, but a series of tunnels, seemingly carved into the earth. The air coming from the tunnels was cold, a stark contrast to the humid jungle air. The smell was strongest here, like I was standing above a vast grave. I cautiously poked my head inside, using my hand to shield my eyes. The darkness was absolute, like staring into a void. I didn't dare step in. The carvings were everywhere now, not just on trees, but on rocks, even in the dirt. I started to see patterns in them, like they were depicting something. Figures, twisted and elongated, in strange rituals. It felt like they were telling a story, a dark, unsettling story, one that I wasn't meant to understand. I can't tell how long it's been since, maybe days, a week. Time began to lose its meaning. Each day is the same. Wake up, eat, drink, walk. Find more ruins and carvings. I feel weak, tired. I'm not sure what I'm looking for anymore, if I ever did. If I ever did. The pale figure returns. I see it mostly at the edge of the jungle clearing now. Always tall and thin, like skin draped over bone. Sometimes I hear it walk. It's not a normal walk. A dragging shuffle, as if it's moving without making any real movement. It's like a ghost or a bad dream. I don't know what it wants. The jungle has become a labyrinth, not of trees, but of fear. I'm moving aimlessly, following these paths, which now feel like they're leading me in circles. I think I'm lost. Something, or maybe someone, is trying to keep me here. And I think maybe it just might succeed. The smell, the carvings, the sounds, the visions, they're all starting to blur together. I'm starting to feel like I'm part of the jungle now. Or maybe it's part of me. I don't know how much more I can take. This place has a way of getting under your skin, of making you forget who you are. And I'm very afraid I'll never leave. Story 22. I've been trekking for 3 days now, pushing further into the Emerald Labyrinth. That was the Mataranka jungle. The guidebooks called it a biodiversity hotspot. But to me, it just felt like a place where the sun forgot to shine, and the shadows had teeth. I wasn't a thrill seeker, not really. I'm a botanist, and my work was my quiet obsession. I was here to collect samples of a certain rare orchid, rumored to flourish in the deepest parts of the reserve. The air hung thick and still, a damp blanket that clung to my skin. Sweat beaded on my forehead, tracing paths down my temples, and every breath felt like inhaling warm, wet cotton. It wasn't the oppressive, humid heat I'd expected. It was more like something else, something heavy. Else. Today, the trail was barely there, an impression of worn earth and broken twigs. I had veered off the marked route yesterday, chasing a fleeting glimpse of a bird with iridescent plumage. That was a mistake. I knew it. But the allure of the unknown was potent. The trees here were ancient, their bark gnarled and twisted like the limbs of some grotesque giants. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Strange, rust-colored fungi sprouted from the rotting logs, and the air carried a faint, earthy mustiness, like the smell of a forgotten tomb. I'd heard rustling in the undergrowth for hours, not the familiar scampering of animals, but something heavier, something that always seemed to be just out of sight. I came to the edge of a clearing, a small circular space where the trees had pulled back as if in fear. A low hummed sound vibrated in the air, a kind of resonating drone that set my teeth on edge. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, a crude circle of weathered stones piled on top of one another. It wasn't natural. It felt deliberate. A strange unease settled in my stomach. I'd seen old ruins in my travels, the remnants of forgotten civilizations. But this was different. This felt malevolent. It was as if the place itself was breathing, exhaling that low hum that seemed to sink into my bones. I circled the structure, my boots crunching on the dried leaves. The stones felt cold, unnaturally so, even in the muggy heat. There were no markings, no carvings to suggest age or purpose. As I continued to circle the structure, I noticed something else. The normal forest sounds had ceased. The usual cicadas and bird calls had gone silent, replaced only by the drone of the stone circle. The silence pressed down on me, a weight that made my ears ring. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I pulled out my small notebook and began sketching the structure, trying to focus on details rather than the creeping dread that was working its way into my mind. I noted the uneven texture of the stones, the way they seemed to be stained a darker color at their base, as if absorbing something. The light began to fade, and the shadows grew longer, twisting the trees into monstrous shapes. I knew I should set up camp, but I found it hard to pull myself away from the circle. I took out my flashlight. Its beam sliced through the gathering gloom, revealing more of the clearing. With each sweep of the light, I thought I saw movement in the periphery, just at the edge of the beam, fleeting shapes that danced in the shadows. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just fatigue and my own overactive imagination. But the strange hum grew louder, the vibrations resonating within me. I finally set up my tent, a flimsy barrier between me and the darkness. I ate a quick meal of dried fruit and nuts, the chewing a loud, intrusive sound in the oppressive silence. I tried to read, but the words swam before me. My heart pounded against my ribs in a steady rhythm of fear. I switched off my flashlight and lay in the darkness, not sleeping, just listening. I knew sleep was impossible. I could still feel that vibrating hum, a sound that spoke of something ancient, something beyond my comprehension. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was safe, but all I saw were shifting shadows in the corners of my tent. The next morning, I woke with a jolt. The sun, though still obscured by the canopy, felt different. It felt cold and thin, and somehow lifeless. The jungle itself seemed muted, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. I carefully unzipped the tent. The stone circle still stood there, its dark presence palpable. But something had changed. A thin mist clung to the ground, a strange gray fog that swirled around the base of the circle. And the hum. The hum had become deeper, more forceful, a low thrum that vibrated in my chest and made my vision blur. The trees seemed closer, as though they had taken a step forward overnight. I took my samples, the leaves and petals I had come to collect. Suddenly, the urge to leave, to break free of this place, was overwhelming. I packed away my things faster than I ever had before, my hands trembling. As I turned to leave, ready to rush blindly into the trees, it was there. I saw a shape at the edge of the clearing, just beyond mist. It was a dark, indistinct form, taller than any man, and it seemed to sway like a tall grass in a breeze that wasn't there. I turned and ran. I pushed through the undergrowth, not caring about scratches or bruises. I didn't turn back. Every sound, every crack and rustle made my heart leap. I ran as I had never run before, trying to escape that place, that feeling, that thing. I haven't been back. Soon a year, and I still have nightmares, dreams filled with that low, vibrating hum. and that dark shape that sways in the mist. I know I should report it, try to explain what I saw. But how do you explain a feeling of utter, primal fear? How do you articulate the sensation of being watched, stalked by something that doesn't exist? I don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Maybe some things are best left lost in the depths of the jungle. Story 23. The worn leather of my boots crunched on the fallen leaves. The sound strangely loud in the oppressive stillness. Sunlight, fractured by the dense canopy, barely reached the forest floor of the dame tree. Not that it mattered. It wasn't the sun I was worried about. I should be focusing on the undergrowth, the tangled vines and the possibility of snakes. But my mind kept drifting back to the map. A hand-drawn sketch, really, with a series of X marks scrawled across it in a faded red ink. The notes it came with were worse, cryptic, and unsettling. Something about whispers in the wind and the trees themselves watching. I'm not usually one for this kind of thing. I'm a geologist, not a ghost hunter. But the disappearance of my colleague, Ben, had pushed me into this. He'd been researching unusual mineral formations in this same area of the Dame Tree a few weeks back, and had sent that map just days before his comms went silent. The local authorities hadn't found anything, not even a trace of his equipment, so now it was up to me, I suppose. The air hung heavy, not with humidity, but with something else, something thick and expectant. The usual forest sounds, the calls of birds, the rustling of small creatures, felt muted, as though they were holding their breaths. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to press in, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. It wasn't a welcoming feeling, more like being squeezed by something unseen. I pushed on, following the map, coming to a small clearing with a peculiar circular stone formation. The stones were smooth, almost polished, and arranged in a perfect ring, not something you'd expect in a place like this. The whole area gave off a sense of being out of place, a feeling like a wrong key in a lock. I ran a finger along the cool stone. It felt unusually smooth, unnervingly smooth for a rock that should have been coarse with moss and the elements. I took out my own GPS unit, but the signal was patchy and unreliable under the dense foliage, which was odd since we tested the same model everywhere else in the area. The silence felt heavier as well, and the feeling of being watched intensified. A prickle on my skin, like being a prey animal somewhere you're very, very exposed. I checked my watch. It had only been about an hour since I entered the forest. The time felt like it was stretching and distorting. I left the clearing, pressing further on. The map denoted another X about a kilometer through another patch of forest. The terrain began to change, the ground becoming softer, almost spongy underfoot. The trees were different too, taller, with thicker trunks that blocked out more light. The leaves were a deeper green, almost black in the shadows. And then I noticed the scent. Not the usual earthy smells of the forest, but something else. Something cloying and sweet, like decaying flowers. Or maybe something else. I can't put my finger on it. I pulled out the map again, checking it against the trees around me. The faded ink seemed to vibrate and morph slightly. At first, it seemed to be my eyes playing tricks on me. I rubbed them hard and looked again. Maybe it was the effect of the strange light. But the red crosses on the map had gotten a shade darker, a deeper, almost blood-red hue. I pushed the thought back down, attributing it to stress. I came to a stream, the water opaque and still, reflecting the dark canopy above like a black mirror. There was no sound of running water, no bird song, no insects, just the oppressive silence pressing down on me. I waded across it, the water surprisingly cold, shocking my skin. On the other side of the stream, the forest seemed to change again. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out in unnatural angles. And the air became colder, a sudden drop in temperature that made my teeth chatter. A shiver ran down my spine. And it had nothing to do with the stream. I looked at the map again. The fourth location. It was a sinkhole. Not a proper one, just a dip in the ground. I was there now. The ground was bare, the soil dry and cracked as if nothing could grow there. And around the edge, almost invisible beneath the leaves and loose earth, I saw markings in the dirt. Fine lines, like something had been dragged across the ground. There was no natural explanation. I circled the hole, my steps muffled by the loose soil. And then I saw it. A small silver object barely visible in the dirt on the edge. It was one of Ben's rock hammers. It was dull, and the grip was dirty, but it was his. My hand went to his name written on the handle, engraved there when he first got it. I wanted to call out his name, to hear my voice break the silence, but I couldn't. It was like a thick, heavy blanket was wrapped around my throat, silencing me. The area felt heavier than before. The sense of being watched had intensified exponentially. I'd seen the hand-carved stones, the strange map, the altered terrain, all of it pointing to something very wrong. I looked at my watch. An hour and a half had passed, yet it felt like the same single long moment. The sky was beginning to darken, and I knew I should be heading back, but I didn't. Instead, I went down into the sinkhole, moving carefully. The air tasted different down there, like copper. The dirt was unnaturally loose. I moved the dirt away, digging with my hands. And as I did, I felt something solid. When I dug it up, it was not a rock, but a human skull. I pulled it from the dirt and held it, the smooth bone cold in my hands. It was hard to make out the details. The face had been stripped away by time or by something else. I dropped it to the floor with a thud. I reached out and moved more earth, finding another skull, and another, and another. The sinkhole was filled with them. I couldn't help myself. I began digging faster, like a man possessed by an unseen force. I clawed at the dirt, uncovering more and more skeletal remains. Then I stopped and felt sick. The forest had gone completely dark. I couldn't see beyond a few feet, and the air was different, thick and cloying. Something was moving. I could feel it. It wasn't something physical, but something I could feel inside me. I backed away slowly from the sinkhole, my back against one of the trees. I looked around, trying to work out which way I had come. But the forest had changed. It was as if the trees had moved. I was lost. I stood there, frozen, every hair on my body standing up. The forest waited with me, that oppressive silence heavier than ever. What started as a search for my friend had turned into something else, something I did not understand, something that did not want me here. There were no more sounds, not even the rustling of leaves. Just me and this silence and the feeling of something moving all around me. And I knew, deep down, that the Daintree wasn't just a forest. It was something else, and I wasn't going to get out of it. I didn't know how long I stood there, but eventually I closed my eyes and accepted it. I felt it then, that final embrace, and then there was nothing, just the darkness and the silence. Story 24. The old Land Cruiser rattled like a cage of loose bones as I navigated the rutted track. Not that there was much to navigate. It was more barely there wound through the thick green flesh of the jungle, somewhere deep in the Kalimantan region of Borneo. The air hung heavy, not just with moisture, but with a strange, still energy. It wasn't the kind of stillness that promised peace. It was the stillness before a storm, or perhaps the stillness of something waiting. I'd come to this place on a whisper of a rumor, a tattered map found amongst the belongings of my grandfather, a man who disappeared without a trace when I was a child. He was a botanist, obsessed with the rarest of orchids, and this particular map had a single point marked, deep within the interior, labeled simply Gunom Soni, the silent mountain. The name sent a shiver down my spine, even before I'd left my home in the city. I wasn't a botanist, not like him. I was a photographer, drawn to the wild places, the untouched corners of the world. But something about this map, some echo of my grandfather's passion, had pulled me. I'd hired a local guide, a wiry man named Booty, who spoke little and looked at me with a mixture of wariness and pity. He'd dropped me off at the edge of the track this morning, refusing to go further, muttering about bad things and old spirits. He'd be back in 2 days, if I was still here. The track was barely wide enough for the vehicle, the jungle pressing in on either side like a living wall. Sunlight, already weak, struggled to pierce the dense canopy. Everything was a mosaic of greens and browns, except for the occasional flash of a bright bird or the glimpse of a snake slithering through the undergrowth. I tried to take a few pictures, but the oppressive gloom seemed to swallow the light before it reached my lens. It was as if the jungle itself didn't want to be recorded. I turned off the engine to walk, the silence immediately dropping like a heavy blanket. It was a silence so profound I could feel it in my bones, a stark contrast to the constant hum and clamor of the city. I followed a narrow path, barely a game trail, that veered off the track towards the mountain's base. I started to feel it then, the shit. The air grew colder, despite the humidity, and the jungle around me felt less like a collection of plants and more like a gathering of eyes. The trees were different here, ancient, their bark twisted and gnarled like the faces of old men. Vines thick as pythons hung from the branches, and strange pale fungi grew in clusters around their bases, glowing faintly in the dim light. I kept moving, drawn deeper inward, my hand instinctively gripping the small compass I wore around my wrist. I took a photograph of an odd, almost geometric pattern on the side of a tree. The bark rippled unnaturally in an odd spiral. I paused, feeling a sudden, inexplicable nausea. I pushed on, the path becoming steeper. The air tasted metallic now, and a faint odor hung around me, like decaying leaves mixed with something acrid. The mountain was still shrouded, the top hidden in the mist and the dense foliage. It was as if it didn't want to be seen, like it was choosing to stay a mystery. As I went further, the trees seemed to grow closer, their branches tangling overhead like skeletal fingers reaching out. I walked for hours. The sun, I realized, had long abandoned its weak attempts to penetrate this place. The only light came from the strange fungi and the ghostly luminescence of the mist that began to swirl around my ankles. I started to notice faint rustling, subtle sounds that didn't quite belong to the natural world. A snapped twig that seemed to come from nowhere, a faint scratch of claws on bark when there was no sign of animal life. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. It was a physical sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, a constant awareness of unseen observers. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the product of isolation and my own fear, but the unease lingered. I found a small clearing, dominated by a huge ancient tree, its roots twisting above the ground like the legs of some immense slumbering beast. Carved into the trunk were strange symbols, not quite like anything I'd seen before. They weren't tribal. They weren't from any known language. They radiated a strange energy, an unsettling feeling that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I pulled out my camera and tried to photograph the symbols, but the camera screen displayed only a blank, static field as if there was no imagery there. I tried several times, to no avail. I began to feel a deep sense of panic. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path back had disappeared. The jungle seemed to have rearranged itself, disorienting me at every turn. I felt a sense of panic rising up my throat. The rustling grew louder, no longer subtle. I heard small whispers on the breeze, like the murmurs of a crowd. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was nothing there. I ran further into the jungle, the sounds following me, growing in intensity. Then, through the mist, I saw them. They weren't human, not quite. Tall, dark shapes that flickered at the edge of my vision, like shadows moving in the periphery. They seemed to be composed of darkness, their forms shifting and indistinct. They were silent, and their presence filled me with a primal terror I'd not known I was capable of feeling. I stumbled, falling to my knees, my breath ragged and shallow. The shadows closed in, their silence more terrifying than any scream. I could feel a coldness radiating from them, a deep and ancient chill that seeped into my very bones. I reached out, my hand grazing the cold bark of an old tree, and then felt something else. A faint vibration, as if the very ground was humming. The symbols on the tree trunk seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. And in that moment I saw, not for the first time, that they looked like runes, not markings. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the terror, waiting for whatever came next. The jungle, that had seemed to be breathing, was silent, the whispers quiet, the shadows still. I didn't open my eyes. I just waited there, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, and felt the slow creep of ice forming in my veins as the humming of the mountain grew louder. Story 25. The rustle started low, like a whisper brushing against the broad leaves of the undergrowth. It wasn't the wind. I knew the difference after living on the edge of the jungle for so long. This was something else. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the canopy, painting the foliage in strokes of deep emerald and bruised purple. I was deeper into the forest than I usually went, drawn by the promise of a rare orchid, a splash of crimson in this endless green. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It clung to my skin, a humid blanket that made each breath feel like a chore. I pushed forward, careful of roots snaking across the ground. Barely visible beneath the tangled carpet of foliage, the rustling intensified slightly, now sounding like something dragging itself through the dense undergrowth. I told myself it was an animal, a large lizard maybe, or a wild pig rooting for tubers, but a rational explanation did little to ease the unease that was beginning to settle in the pit of my stomach. The shadows deepened, the forest floor now a mosaic of fractured light and impenetrable blackness. I passed by a cluster of trees whose trunks were unnaturally smooth, almost polished, like bone. It was not a species I recognized, and I suddenly remembered that I had never seen them before. In the years of walking through these woods, an old trail, one I had not used for a while, emerged from the left, a path overgrown with ferns and vines. I paused, unsure which way to continue. I had never found the path particularly alluring, and the thought of walking its length was repulsive to me. I picked up a small stone and threw it into the trees, the satisfying thud of the stone breaking the silence for the briefest moment. I took a breath, pushing the sense of unease aside, and pushed into the woods. I could feel the sun rapidly disappearing beyond the canopy now, and realized that the light would be gone in minutes. The rustling, now a distinct dragging sound, had moved closer. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig. I reached for my knife instinctively. The familiar weight, the small comfort against the rising fear. My heart thumped against my ribs, each pulse echoing in the sudden silence that followed the strange sounds. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the heavy silence and the thrum of my own heartbeat. I began to walk, this time with a purpose. I needed to return to the small settlement and the safety of my small hut. I didn't have time for the orchids today. I followed my own trail, using familiar landmarks as a guide. The air felt different now, colder, and I could feel a thin layer of goosebumps arise from my skin. It was as though I had entered the depths of winter, a chill completely out of line with the humid environment. I was going slower now, using the limited light to check my surroundings and to ensure I was not lost. A fate I felt I was pushing towards. I noticed something unusual. A large cluster of mushrooms, the size of dinner plates, growing in a circle at the base of a large tree. They were the color of bruised flesh, and the cap of each one pulsated slightly, like a living heart. I had never seen mushrooms like that before. There were many strange things in this jungle, but the mushrooms were especially unnerving to me. A sense of caution was rapidly consuming me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I continued along the path and began to walk quickly, my breath short and sharp. And then I saw it. A flash of movement, a pale shape flitting between the trees, just on the edge of my vision. I stopped and squinted, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But there was nothing. Just the dense trees and the long shadows. The pale shape vanished as quickly as it appeared. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a reflection of my own fear. The dragging sound started again, a little closer now, a touch louder, making my stomach turn cold. I walked faster, ignoring the growing panic. The rustle of my clothes adding to the unnerving sounds of the forest. I could feel my own pace quickening, my breath coming in shallow gasps, each footstep sending up small clouds of dust in the last rays of light. I passed a clearing where the ground was strangely bare, not an inch covered by the endless foliage, just smooth, ochre-colored soil. The air hung stagnant in the space, and I felt a palpable weight descend around me, as though something was pressing down from above. I noticed that the birds had stopped singing, and the insects had gone silent, too, a sure sign the forest was holding its breath. I glanced to my right, where I could just make out a tree with a strange shape. The tree stood out from the rest, not because of its size, but because the bark was as smooth as bone, and the trunk was deeply scarred, making it look as though it had been ravaged by fire. As I stared at the tree, I suddenly noticed what looked like eyes watching me. They were perfectly still and completely silent, and I stood in the shadows, unsure if they were real or a trick of the light. The eyes seemed to follow me as I slowly backed away from them, and they were not the eyes of any animal I had seen before. The eyes did not blink. They showed nothing other than the barest hint of a pupil, a small black dot in a sea of white. I started to run now, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face, the thorns that tore at my clothes. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I was driven forward by a primal fear, a need to escape something I could not see, but could definitely feel. The dragging sound was louder now, closer, and I was joined by a low, guttural moan, a sound that was completely alien to any other sounds I had ever heard in this forest. I didn't know what was making the noise, but it was the kind of sound that sent a shiver down my spine, one that I knew I would never forget. I stumbled, my hands scrabbling against the earth, the gritty soil digging into my palms. I scrambled to my feet, spitting dirt from my mouth. I could see the edge of the trees now, the familiar outline of the clearing near my home. I could hear the small stream that ran past my door. It was so close now, but it felt like it was miles away. The sounds were louder still, and the pale shape was back, this time not a fleeting moment, but a tangible outline, just beyond the periphery. It was tall, a gaunt figure moving erratically through the undergrowth, and it sounded like it was getting closer. I was running again, my body aching, my breath ragged. I burst from the tree line and into the clearing, my bare feet pounding on the soft earth. The stream was just ahead, and just beside it, my home. I ignored the frantic pounding in my chest and the urge to look behind me, and I threw the door open, bolting myself inside and jamming the large wooden beam across the door frame. I stood still now, leaning against the door, listening for any sounds from outside. The forest was silent. Too silent. I waited in the darkness, my heart still hammering, hoping the silence would last. But I knew, deep down, that whatever I had seen, whatever I had heard, was still out there, and it would be waiting for my next move. It was a long time before I dared to move, and it was even longer before I dared to look outside. I was not going to go into the woods tomorrow, or any day after that. The forest had changed. It was not safe anymore. Story 26. The thick scent of decay was the first thing to hit me. Not the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood, but the heavy, cloying sweetness of something long gone bad. It clung to the air, coating my throat, making me want to gag. I'd been tracking the signal for 3 days now, deeper and deeper into the heart of the Kalimantan rainforest. A distress beacon, faint but persistent, the kind that made your skin crawl. Not with fear, but with a deep, unsettling unease. The map the satellite had projected onto my wrist-mounted device was clear, but the terrain was anything but. The towering trees, centuries old, filtered out the sun, casting the jungle floor in a perpetual twilight. Vines, thick as pythons, snaked across the path, and strange phosphorescent fungi cast an eerie green glow from the base of ancient trees. It wasn't just the physical obstacles. There was a weight here, a palpable presence that felt like a cold hand resting on the back of my neck. I pushed through a curtain of hanging moss, the damp fibers brushing my face like spider webs. The air grew colder, and the heavy scent of decay intensified. My boots sank into a layer of decaying leaves, each step a muffled crunch in the oppressive silence. The only sound came from the strange, rhythmic pulse which had grown louder in my ears the closer I had come. It was the signal, but it was distorted, almost like a heartbeat, yet deeply inhuman. I began to feel disoriented. The undergrowth became denser, the trees closer, and the world seemed to shrink. The phosphorescent fungi were no longer an ambient glow, but pulsating with a sickening light, as if they were feeding on the darkness around them. I found myself glancing over my shoulder frequently, a primal urge taking hold. It felt like I was being watched, not by any animal, but by something ancient and malevolent. I paused, noticing this subtle shift in the foliage. Some of the leaves were a lighter shade of green, their veined patterns forming almost perfect circles. They were not natural. They weren't of this place. The pulsing in my ears became deafening. Each beat sharp and insistent, like a drum calling to something that is not known by man. The distress beacon, the reason I had come this far, was not fading. It was growing louder, changing. It was growing louder, changing. I broke through the dense undergrowth, stumbling onto a small clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, its surface so heavily eroded that it was impossible to tell its purpose. The distress signal pulsed from within it, a throbbing light emanating from what appeared to be a small opening. It was here. This was where it came from. I approached, each step heavy and hesitant. The stones felt cold, almost clammy beneath my fingers. The opening was small, barely big enough to squeeze through, and the darkness beyond was absolute. The scent of decay was now overpowering, making my stomach churn. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand trembling. Was it a trap? The rational part of me screamed, yes. The reckless part screamed, go. I pushed forwards, forcing my shoulders through the gap. I was inside. The air changed immediately. It was still, heavy, and thick like a wet blanket. I could just make out a circular-shaped room with markings on the walls that seemed to writhe and shift in the faint light that trickled through the entranceway, as if they were alive. I felt faint and cold. An unseen weight pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air was now colder than it was outside, and yet the feeling of being watched grew even more intense. I turned towards the source of the signal to see a small device on the ground, its light flickering erratically. Next to the device was a set of worn boots, half buried in the damp soil where they had fallen. I reached for the device. The cold, heavy feeling washed over me entirely, like I had fallen into the depths of the ocean. As I touched it, a torrent of images exploded into my mind, a cacophony of unearthly screams, ancient rituals, and the cold, pitiless gaze of something not of this world. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The device was dead. The silence returned, but it was different now, thick with a presence that lingered like an echo. As I stood there, a strange feeling of vertigo washed over me, as if the ground had become too soft, and I was sinking within it into the earth. I backed out of the circle with the urgency and feeling of terror in my heart. I left the boots there, for whoever they once belonged to had passed. But as I started to retrace my steps back into the jungle, I saw them, not the fungi, casting a strange glow, but new, more numerous circles in the foliage. This time they were everywhere, following me, and yet the wind didn't touch them. What had been there was still there, and now it seemed to be following me home. Story 27. The mist that clung to the slopes of Mount Cinder was not like mist anywhere else. It was thick, almost solid, swirling with an unnatural energy as the gray blanket of cloud moved through the area. It was as if the mountain itself was exhaling something cold and ancient. I'd been told the fog never lifted from this place, that it covered the old logging trails like a shroud. I dismissed the stories as folklore, the ramblings of paranoid locals. But now, deep into the mountain's embrace, I wasn't so sure, and I should have turned back. The abandoned logging camp was my objective, a place where workers had vanished without a trace. I had come to make some sense of it, to record and maybe explain this phenomena. The path, barely visible beneath the dense vegetation, wound its way ever higher. The air was heavy and carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic that made my stomach churn. The sun, a distant memory, had been swallowed by the fog, leaving me in a cold, muted whirl. The trees here were different from those below. They were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The fog seemed to cling to them, forming strange shapes that shifted and changed with every breath I took. I began to see them from the corner of my eye, not defined, but like a glimpse of a form, hidden behind the trees, watching me as I walked. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft sighing of the wind. It was not a natural wind, but something that seemed to whisper secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I noticed a pattern emerging in the fog, swirling patterns that looked like eyes, staring at me with cold calculation. Each time I brushed one, it would simply reform a few seconds later. The logging camp appeared abruptly, a collection of rotting shacks that looked like they had been clawed at by something unspeakable. The wood was warped and brittle. The windows were gaping holes that seemed to stare into a void. There was a heavy feeling of decay here, a residue of something horrible. I saw a few footprints in the soft earth. They were not mine. I stepped onto the porch of the first cabin, the boards groaning under my weight. The door was hanging off its hinges, and when I pushed it open, it swung inward with a loud screech. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew and rot. There was a sense that something had recently been here. The air was thick and cold, almost like stepping into a freezer. Inside, the shadows seemed to writhe, and I saw shapes that moved in the periphery of my vision. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then the shapes became more defined, more deliberate. It was like the shadows were trying to detach themselves from the walls move in between me and my escape. I edged through the cabin with trepidation, moving into the main room. Furniture lay in disarray, and amongst toppled bunk beds and scattered tools, I found a thick leather-bound logbook, soaked in rain. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanned the entries. They spoke of strange noises, of shadows in the fog, and of a growing paranoia that had consumed them all. The final entry was cut short, and was simply the sentence, "It's coming closer." These people were afraid of something. Something that wasn't natural. The fog outside pressed against the windows. I could hear it sighing, and I felt like it was trying to get closer. The strange forms in the shadows became more defined, and I could finally tell what I saw. They were long, thin, and seemed to be made of the same mist that clung to the mountain slopes. They had no eyes, just dark holes where their face should have been. A sudden shift in air pressure made me stumble, and I realized that I was no longer alone in the cabin. I felt it move through me, a cold, heavy feeling that seemed to grasp at my soul. A force pushed me back out of the doorway. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I fled the cabin in a frantic sprint. The sighing of the fog intensified, and I felt like I was being chased by 1,000 unseen hands. I stumbled through the undergrowth, desperate to escape the clearing. The fog swirled around me, the shapes becoming more numerous, and their presence felt even more hostile. I ran and ran, and just when I thought I would collapse, the forest finally broke, and I stumbled out of the mist. I turned around to see the fog and the logging camp behind it remain where they were, hiding like they had been for years, never truly letting anyone escape. Story 28. The taste of dust was the first thing I noticed. Not just the dry, earthy dust of a forgotten road, but the acrid, almost metallic taste of ancient stone. It clung to the back of my throat, a constant nagging reminder of where I was. The lost ruins of Xantus, buried deep within the Guatemalan jungle. I had come to explore, to document, and to uncover the secrets of a civilization long lost to time. I never thought that the place would want to keep me inside forever. The jungle was thick and oppressive, the air heavy with humidity. The trees, ancient and towering, filtered out the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Vines snaked across my path, and strange, colorful birds called out from the canopy above. But there was a silence here, too. A heavy silence that was almost as terrifying as any sound. I could feel it in my bones, in the air I breathed. I navigated through the undergrowth, my machete clearing a path through the dense vegetation. I used the map my guide had given me. The place was described as a place where the earth sleeps. I couldn't have understood what it meant at the time. The ruins were not far, and the remains of the once great city started to appear. I made sure to note how the foliage was encroaching on every stone, reclaiming the place as it had done time and time again. The first structure I came to was an enormous pyramid, its stone steps eroded and crumbling. The blocks were covered in glyphs, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as I looked upon them. I felt a pull towards this place, and I proceeded towards a large opening, a dark maw in the base of the pyramid, almost like it was waiting for me to come closer. The closer I got, the more I felt it. Something beneath that wanted to take me into its dark depths. I stepped inside, and the air changed immediately. It became cold and still, and the taste of dust intensified. The interior was a maze of dark corridors and chambers, their walls lined with more glyphs and strange carvings. In the center of one of the chambers, I saw a circular hole in the floor. From within it emanated a low humming sound, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate deep within my lungs. I felt drawn to the hole, a powerful urge to peer inside. It was the source of that deep hum, a feeling that I would never be the same again if I saw what was inside. I kneeled at the hole. My hands rested on the cold stone border. The humming grew louder, and the air seemed to vibrate around. I could see nothing at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out movement. There was something down there, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to have been drawn up by the sound itself, beckoning me. Something was down there, and I knew it had been waiting for me to look inside. I began to feel dizzy. The humming was almost unbearable. The ground beneath me felt soft, and I noticed that the stone was starting to crumble. The dust was getting thicker, and every breath became harder than the last. Shadows moved as if they had a life of their own, and I felt them reaching out to me, hungry to take another form. I struggled to pull back, to move away, but I was frozen. With a lunge backwards, I stumbled away from the hole and back into the passage. I ran without looking, my heart pounding in my chest, and I didn't stop until I was outside the pyramid, gasping for breath. The jungle seemed louder and more vibrant than ever, and I almost wept with relief at the thought that I was still alive. It was the taste of dirt that reminded me of my mistake. I had to leave, and I had to now. I began making my way back through the ruins and out into the forest. This time, the glyphs on the stones were not just symbols. They were moving and shifting. They seemed to be following me, watching me as I passed. I moved faster. My pace became a desperate sprint as I began to feel the same humming return. I could feel the presence growing closer. And this time, it didn't seem like it wanted me to look. It wanted me to be taken back, to be joined with the earth. But I finally managed to break free from the ruins and out from the embrace of the ancient city. I could still feel the vibrations in my bones. I could still taste the dust in the back of my throat, like a curse that would never fully leave me. As I looked back at those ruins, I noticed that the jungle seemed to press in, as if the world itself wanted to keep them hidden forever. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the earth had not been asleep at all. It had been waiting. Story 29. The jungle pressed in around me, a wall of green that seemed to breathe. I was in Bukit Lawang, Sumatra, Indonesia, a place known for its orangutan sanctuary, but I was here hunting for something different. I had heard stories of strange rituals practiced by the tribes deep in the jungle, rumors of a dark presence that lingered in the ancient forest. I had dismissed them as folklore, of course, but something drew me here, some morbid curiosity to see the source of the stories. I had a small backpack with the essentials, and my camera ready to document anything interesting I encountered. The path was narrow and muddy, winding deeper into the jungle. It didn't take long before I realized that I was alone, and there was no clear path. It was like the jungle didn't want any clear paths. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence of the jungle was oppressive. The sounds of the jungle almost felt muted, like the world was trying to shut out the light. I felt a strong sense of loneliness that I had never felt before, and it wasn't because no one was there with me. It was more like the whole world was empty, and I was the only one there. I started to feel it creep under my skin. This uncomfortable feeling that I was not welcome here, that this place was not for me. I pushed forward, the jungle floor a shifting carpet of roots and fallen leaves. I started seeing things, shapes that appeared in my peripheral vision, but vanished when I turned to look. It was like my eyes were playing tricks. With each fleeting glimpse, my heart would skip a beat. I told myself to ignore them, that it was just exhaustion and the lack of sleep making my mind play tricks. I came across an old clearing, a strange circle of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. A strange sense of unease settled in my stomach as I entered. I didn't even know what it was exactly, but it was something I wanted to stay away from. I started to notice odd carvings on the bark of the trees, strange symbols that looked like distorted faces. I snapped a picture with my camera, hoping the image would reveal something I couldn't see with my own eyes. As the sun began to set, I made a small camp, using my waterproof tarp and hammock. The light faded fast, the jungle becoming a maze of shadows. I felt a presence, something just beyond my senses. I couldn't see it or hear it, but I knew something was there. I had heard about the jungle playing tricks on your mind, and I was starting to think it was all true. I kept my flashlight close, the beam of light a small beacon in the vast darkness. That night I tried to sleep, but any time I managed to doze off, I was woken up by what felt like the sound of footsteps just outside of my camp, moving slowly, circling me. In the dark, I kept checking my surroundings, but there was never anything there. The next morning, the photos on my camera were gone. The memory card was completely wiped. It was as if the jungle had taken back whatever I had tried to capture. A sense of dread filled me as I started my hike. I didn't want to stay here, but I didn't know which way I had come. It was like the jungle had rearranged itself in the night. The trees seemed taller, the foliage denser, and the path I had followed the day before was gone. I was truly alone now. No maps, no directions, just the jungle and me. The feeling of being watched became more intense. The rustling in the leaves now seemed to be following my every step. I swear I could see eyes in the gaps between the trees, always disappearing the moment I looked directly at them. I started to talk to myself, trying to calm myself down, convince myself that it was all in my head, but I knew deep down that I was in over my head. I kept walking, not knowing where I was going, getting more and more disoriented. I felt like I was losing track of time. Every single sound in the jungle made me jump. The sunlight seemed to become dimmer. The jungle felt like it was closing in on me. I decided to start climbing up onto the higher ground, hoping I would get a better view of my surroundings. I scaled a few higher rocks when I noticed something in the distance. It looked like a clearing, and as I got closer I realized that it was the same clearing I had slept in the previous night. I was back in the same circle of bare earth, now with a feeling of sheer panic. It felt like the jungle was playing with me, leading me on a path that I could never leave. I didn't know what to do. I was completely lost, exhausted, and afraid as I turned my head around to look at the trees. I could have sworn that I saw a face, and it was smiling at me. Story 30. Sunlight. Thick and golden, like honey, struggled to pierce the canopy above, creating dappled patterns across the dashboard and my hands on the wheel. It wasn't the humidity that bothered me today, or the relentless whir of insects. It was the stillness. An unnatural quiet had settled over this part of the Cambodian jungle, an absence of the usual chirps and rustles that normally painted the soundscape. My job, as a freelance cartographer, often led me to these remote places, but this time felt different, charged. My task was simple: to trace the old logging trails around the area of Koh Rong, the network reclaimed by the jungle years ago. Locals, mostly fishermen and farmers who lived along the coast, spoke of these woods in hushed tones, not of wild animals, but of something else. They called it the path that forgets. I hadn't given their stories much credit, attributing their fears to folklore and the isolation of their lives. Now, though, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched by something unseen. The path was nearly invisible now, a subtle depression in the dense undergrowth. The trees pressed in close, their gnarled limbs like skeletal fingers reaching out. I parked the Land Cruiser under heavy shade, the engine sputtered dying into the oppressive quiet. I grabbed my mapping equipment, GPS, compass, notebook camera, and slung my backpack on. The air, close and thick, pressed against my skin. I took a deep breath, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filling my lungs. It wasn't the pleasant earthy smell of a forest, but heavier, almost acrid. I started walking, following the faintest of trails, my boots crunching on fallen branches and twigs. The sunlight here was almost non-existent, just a dim glow filtering through the layers of leaves above. Time seemed to slow, each step an effort, each rustle of leaves amplified. I felt an urge to look back constantly, forced myself to keep going. After what I gauged to be about an hour, I came across an old clearing, overgrown with thick clumps of bamboo. I recognized it immediately from the old maps I'd studied as a place marked Camp 3. Years of neglect had taken their toll. The wooden frames of what used to be buildings were half buried in vines, their shadows long and distorted. I pulled out my maps and began to cross-reference them with my location, noting the changes the years had wrought. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the buzz of some unseen insect. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. As I worked, I noticed something peculiar. It was a faint, sweet smell, like jasmine, but rotting. It was subtle, but it made my stomach churn. I dismissed it at first, thinking it might be a flower I couldn't see. But it lingered. It became stronger. I took pictures of the remains of the camp, carefully documenting my findings, but I felt a growing sense of unease. The shadows around me seemed to lengthen, to swirl. I thought of the old fisherman's stories, the path that forgets. I checked my compass and found that the needle was swinging wildly, erratic, almost like it was afraid. My GPS was showing an error message, blinking a blood-red light. It never did that. I decided I would leave soon, yet every few steps I took, I felt a pull, compelling me further into the jungle. I resisted by constantly looking to see if I could find the way back. I knew I could follow the trail that I came from. My hands were starting to tremble now. My heart was beating fast, and I started to sweat, not from the heat, but from what I thought may be fear. I started to notice small, strange things. On some old tree bark, I saw carvings, not of anything familiar, but of strange symbols, unlike anything I'd seen in my time in the field. They looked crude, almost childlike, but there was something unsettling about them that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. As I walked further, the undergrowth became denser, almost impassable, and the sweet smell grew sharper. It made its way into my nostrils, turning my stomach inside and out. There was something almost cloying about it now, and now I could hear it. Faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like voices in another room. I couldn't make out any particular words, just the murmur of many voices, all murmuring at once. I tried my best not to panic. I pushed my way through the vines, telling myself it was all in my head. It wasn't. I found myself now in a small natural clearing. The trees around me formed a circle, almost like they were watching. In the center, it was almost like a stage. There was nothing on the ground there, just dirt, and the sweet, rotting scent had become overpowering. I covered my nose and mouth with my shirt, but the smell had somehow permeated everything, and now tasted disgusting. The whispers were louder now, rising and falling in what felt like rhythmic chants. My skin felt clammy. I needed to get out of there. I turned around, trying to find the path I'd taken, but it was gone. There was no break in the dense foliage, no imprint of my footsteps, nothing. It was as if the jungle had swallowed the path whole. I felt a surge of pure panic. I took another step back, but I couldn't find the path. I was starting to lose it now. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows and making the jungle even darker. I pulled out my phone, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. No bars. It felt like I was being cut off, isolated. The whispers were still there. I felt like I had no control on what was happening, and the darkness seemed to be pressing down on me. I moved to the edge of the clearing, hoping to orient myself with the landscape. When I saw it, in the fading light, there was something in the tree branches. A figure hanging, suspended. It looked like a scarecrow. something humanoid and draped in tattered clothes. It was facing me, its head lolling to the side. As I stared, I could make out a suggestion of matted hair, a pale face, and dark, empty eye sockets. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs. I turned and ran back to the center of the clearing, and then I ran in the other direction. I was running blind now, not knowing where I was going. I wanted to yell, but there was no way to do that. It was like some unseen force had stolen my voice. I tripped over a root as I ran stumbling my way through the woods, landing heavily on my knees. With what little strength I had left, I pushed myself up and kept going. The whispers were louder now. I turned around again, and I saw it again. This time, it was on the ground, in front of me. It was closer now, the sweet smell stronger than ever. It was standing in a crouched position. Its dark eyes were fixed on me, not moving an inch. Terror consumed me as I realized it wasn't just a scarecrow. I ran again, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from it. I knew now that I was lost. I was in the path of the forgotten, and I would be forgotten too. The jungle was swallowing me whole. It was all I could do to just keep running into the darkness, knowing that it was almost upon me.